Chapter 12. Miscommunication. It was a slow day in the cafe. It was midweek, and nothing especially interesting was going on. I practiced my recipe about as many times as I felt was productive, so I didn't have that to occupy my time anymore. I didn't want to start overthinking my dish and end up doing badly during the competition because of such. It was only a week away, and my nerves were already building up. It'll be fine, Kishka. It'll be fine. I kept trying to reassure myself, but it was hard because of all the doubts circulating in my mind. Thankfully, my boss was incredibly understanding of my feelings, so he often tried to give me small, menial tasks to keep my distracting thoughts at bay. He really was a good guy. I didn't know what I did to deserve him. As of right then, I had started placing orders for some supplies for the following week's shipment, since we'd had a few custom orders placed and we were running low on some things. The task was tedious, but it kept me busy. There were often several items in the order list that were similar to a few other items, so making sure I got the right product number was important and required lots of focus, which helped distract me. As I was typing away, one of the waitresses peeked her head inside the office, looking my way. "Amochi?" She spoke my name in a questioning tone. I looked at her. "Yeah," I replied, blinking as my eyes got adjusted to looking away from the computer after having stared at it for a while. "There's someone to see you," she said in reply. Someone here to see me. Looking at the time, since it was after school hours, it was probably Puropi or Runaka. Either way, I didn't feel like leaving the office to go see them. I can't really imagine I'd be scolded for letting them in the office, so... "Can you bring them back here?" I asked her, looking to the computer screen and adding some confectioner's sugar onto the order list. The waitress nodded and left my peripheral, with her footsteps sounding down the hallway along with her. I wondered which one of the two decided to visit that day. I pulled out my phone and made sure I didn't miss any texts. Nope. A surprise visit then? It took a few minutes for anyone to arrive, so I used the time to complete my ordering, just about done right before my guest arrived. And it wasn't who I was expecting. At the door to the office was Hirose Todona. She was dressed warmly, clearly fighting against the cold weather outside. Her hair was tied up in two low pigtails, wearing a wool dress, scarf, and a hat. Upon entering, she walked slowly into the room, looking a little sheepish. I couldn't blame her, seeing as I was not interested in seeing her and had no intention to hide that on my face, nor my body language. I frowned at her appearance in front of me, looking away from her and back at the computer. "What's up?" I replied flatly. I probably shouldn't have been rude, but I was doing about all I could to not tell her to leave. The response I went with would have to do. Once I addressed her, she took a few steps into the office and walked up to the extra chair that sat across from the desk. She set her palms down on top of it, leaning against it, but not sitting. I could feel her gaze pretty intensely on me, so I eventually stopped looking at my computer screen and looked at her. Then she finally spoke up. "I'm sorry, Emoshi." An apology? She lowered her gaze after speaking, eyes no longer on me. The prideful class representative girl that was usually so perky was now a lot more reserved, and it felt strange. "I was wrong to push the whole school thing the other day, and it made things weird between us. So I wanted to apologize, to go back to being friends." Her words sat with me for a moment, and I mulled them over in my head. She said all that, yet her calling us friends was hard to accept as genuine. Were we friends? We'd hung out a few times, but she never seemed to take much interest in me, and vice versa. She was probably only saying it for Pudopi's sake, actually. If the two people that were close to her were not getting along, it put Pudopi in a weird spot more than anyone. I sighed. "Yeah," was all I said in response. I wasn't sure what else was appropriate to say. I could spill my thoughts to her, but I felt like that would only make things more convoluted. But Hirose didn't seem pleased with my response, frowning. I guess things weren't going to be all that simple after all. "Amochi, can you take this seriously?" Her tone was more cross, and I felt like I was being scolded by her all of a sudden, which didn't make me feel any better about the situation. I sighed audibly. Take what seriously? We were never friends, were we? I know this probably means a lot to Pudopi that we get along, but I can't help feeling like you're only apologizing on her behalf. I grumbled. There. I said it. If she was going to be all up in my business, I guess there was no point not to speak my mind then. The girl frowned, her shoulders slumping. I'm not. She took her hands off of the chair and crossed them instead, leaning back as she stood in front of the desk. Listen, Emoji, I know you probably dealt with a lot of unfair stuff lately, but it's really unfair to me to be punished because of it. Like she was one to talk. Hidose probably only heard about things secondhand from Pudopi, so she didn't actually understand what all I'd been through. But her words weren't untrue. And I knew that. Maybe I was being unfair to her, and it kind of sucked to hear someone actually say it. But I frowned. Hidose looked like she was going to say something else, but held her tongue. After a moment of silence, she spoke up again. I don't want to scold you, okay? And I'm sorry that I hurt your feelings then, and maybe even now. Hidose began to play with the end of her hair, looking away from me as she talked. I really do want us to become friends, though. We can't if you have a grudge against me for a little mistake I'm trying to fix. I sat there without a word, not sure how to articulate my feelings. Also, I was curious if there was anything else she was going to say before I replied, so silent I stayed. I'm sorry, Emoji. As both Todone Hirose and also Pudopi's friend, I'm sorry I went too far and I want to make it right. And I want to be friends. Can we try? Hidose looked to me, offering a small, sympathetic smile my way. When she laid it all out like that, it really made me feel silly about why I was still being rude to her. Maybe she was right. The only reason I was holding a grudge against her was because of my parents. I realized that. And she's not my parents. In fact, she actually apologized, which was something my parents never did. She apologized not just once, but several times, and even asked for a truce of sorts. I stared down at my desk. Now that I started to see things differently, the only thing that really sucked now was admitting I was wrong for treating her that way. I wasn't intentionally trying to be mean to her, but I guess the same could be said for her. We really were on equal playing fields. She wasn't trying to hurt me when she said the things she said, and it'd be better if I just forgave her. My eyes looked back up to hers. Yeah, I nodded to her and scratched at the back of my neck. It's okay. And you're right. I gulped down my reluctant feelings, nervousness accompanying me. I didn't like admitting I was wrong, but I guess no one did. I was silent for a moment. I wasn't being fair to you, and it would be nice, at the very least for Pudopi, if we got along. Sorry for making things complicated. Finally, I got the words out, and as hard as it was, I knew it would probably pay off in the end. If it didn't hurt me and made Pudopi happy, then why not do it, you know? Hidose smiled, nodding at me and setting her hands on her hips. She looked relieved and more comfortable now. It's okay. No harm done, for the most part. She grinned a bit wider at that, most likely teasing me with the statement. I didn't reply and only nodded, slowly looking back to my computer screen. Oh, but that's not the reason I came here. Hidose spoke up again. Oh? Was there something else? I looked back to her and away from my computer screen again, letting her take my attention. Hidose then looked behind her, out the office door, and then back to me. She sat down in the chair that sat across from the desk and scooted closer to me, lowering her voice. Uh-oh. What was this about? I felt nervous again. I know this isn't really any of my business, but Pudopi refuses to bring it up with you, so I wanted to ask. Hidose spoke quieter. It's okay if you don't want to answer, but just know this is for her sake, not mine, okay? Hidose sounded so serious in her tone, and it really did make me feel uneasy. What was it that Pudopi couldn't even bring up to me? Her and I hadn't been together all that long, but I already felt a little bothered that she was hiding something from me. I nodded in response to Hidose. I wanted to know what she was going to say, and the sooner she started speaking, the sooner I'd feel about it. Probably. Hidase smiled now and tilted her head to the side. And there's a picture for this chapter. Do you find Pudopi unattractive? Huh? The question sprung out of nowhere, and I found it hard to understand why Hidase had asked at all. It wasn't that I had high standards for beauty, nor did I have no standards at all. It just wasn't necessarily something that was a big deal to me. And I didn't recall ever saying or implying that I found Pudopi's appearance unappealing. In fact, I even called her cute before. I frowned, lowering a brow and raising the other. No, what gave you that impression? I asked. Hidase tilted her head to the right side and pressed her lips together as she pondered for a moment. Well, again, it's none of my business, and she was the one who brought it up to me, so... Hidase almost seemed to be stalling to get to her point. If Pudopi felt like I didn't think she was cute or something, wouldn't it have been easy to just tell me herself? You haven't kissed at all since the first time, right? Hidase asked. What? I felt a little uncomfortable that the girl had known that at all, and asked, but it was true. Our lips hadn't touched each other's at all since that day, but it wasn't like it was a mutual kiss that time anyway. Pudopi was the one that kissed me. No, I replied, leaning back in my seat. How are those related? Huh? Hidase looked at me, confusion set on her features. What do you mean? What did she mean? What did I mean? I felt frustrated at her question. I don't see how looks and kissing are related. Those are two different things. Maybe there was something I was missing, because Hidase's confused expression didn't change at all as I spoke. Was there something she knew that I didn't know about all this? I had a sinking feeling that maybe it was due to my inexperience in relationships. Wait. Hidase put a hand to her forehead and smiled a little, shaking her head. She looked to be both amused and also in disbelief. She then stopped smiling, eyes widening, when I didn't change my expression at all. It frustrated me that it seemed like she knew something I didn't. Do you really not understand emoji? Her eyes stared straight at me, and I could already sense some pity behind them. I frowned. No, I grumbled, leaning back in my seat. I don't. I was already starting to feel sore talking to her again. She questioned my life choices, and now she was questioning my relationship with Pudopi? No. She said that it had to do with things Pudopi had mentioned to her before. I needed to listen and not get so defensive. Hidase lowered her arms and crossed them, smiling a little more at me, but not necessarily in a happy way. She let out a small sigh. So, you don't want to kiss Pudopi or anything when you see her? The question she asked was embarrassing. What kind of question was that? I don't know. I didn't really stare at people and think about kissing them all the time. Was that weird? I mean, if I was honest, there had been times in the past where I thought about kissing her back. It had just been a while since she kissed me. I wanted to do it again, but I don't know, I mumbled, looking away from her. This was weird, talking about kissing Pudopi at work in front of her friend. Why would Hidase even want to talk about that in the first place? What about holding her or something? Do you never want to touch her at all? Hidase questioned some more, which only made me feel more awkward. Touch Pudopi? That was weird when she put it like that. And all in all, I didn't usually do that sort of thing. That was usually Pudopi's field of expertise. She'd hugged on me and held my hand and stuff. I never did that. Why are you asking me this? I grumbled, growing increasingly more uncomfortable with our conversation as time went on. It felt so inappropriate to be talking about, but maybe I was the only one feeling that way. Hidase didn't seem to be fazed by it at all, keeping a level head the whole time while I was practically squirming in my seat. Because... Hidase's expression changed, looking sad. She looked down at her lap for a moment before she looked back up at me, our eyes meeting again. She thinks that you don't like her that much because you never do stuff like that. I mean, that's just what she told me, though. The girl shrugged. And so she thinks that maybe you don't find her attractive because of it, I guess? Was that it? I frowned. So Pudupi thought that because I never kissed her or touched her, that I didn't like her? I thought that just hanging out and talking all the time spoke for itself, but I guess that wasn't enough. We hadn't been dating all that long. Didn't it make sense not to rush into anything too serious so early on? I didn't know. I never had a relationship before. Hidose picked up on my silence and sighed. If you're not interested in her, you shouldn't play with her heart emoji. It's not like that. I spoke up. That wasn't it at all. At least, I didn't think so. It's just... God. I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to admit that Pudupi was my first relationship, and my first kiss, and the first person to hold my hand aside from my brother. It was embarrassing to think about how Hidose might have judged me if I admitted to it. But what other choice did I have? I could have just kept it to myself, but if Pudupi really was feeling badly because of how I was acting, I probably should have tried to get as much advice as I could. I've never done this before, this whole relationship thing. I've never kissed someone or took someone out on a date or did that cuddle stuff or whatever. My cheeks burned as I spoke, and I was glad that the room was dimly lit so that maybe it wouldn't have been too obvious how flustered I was. But even if it wasn't, I was sure my uncomfortable body language made it clear. Am I messing things up with her because we haven't done any of that? I sighed. I really was unsure about the whole thing. She never really tried to kiss me again since back then, and while she was more eager to hug me as time went on, she never said anything about wanting me to return the favor. I just assumed everything was fine, as it was, and eventually we'd get more serious and comfortable later down the line. I guess I was wrong? Hidose looked surprised by what I said, but quickly tried to mask it, even though it was too late. I knew she was surprised to hear it, and I expected that sort of response anyway. I was working an adult lifestyle with no experience in the romantic field, and I wasn't sure that was a common thing. Her expression returned back to sympathetic, smiling my way. Does Pudupi know this is your first relationship? The girl asked. I shook my head in reply, which caused Hidose to nod slowly in return. I see. That's kind of interesting, really. Interesting? Interesting how? I raised an eyebrow at her statement and crossed my arms. What do you mean? I mumbled, curious where her thoughts laid. She smiled some more. Well, most guys I've met who've never been in a relationship before are pretty handsy, actually. You seem like you're the exact opposite, right? Hidose ended her sentence on a questioning note, and it caused me to self-reflect. I mean, I wasn't really the type to put my hands on others at all, nor was I the type who desired for others to put their hands on me. I wondered why that was. Maybe it's because of my inexperience, I said, thinking out loud. I didn't think that was really it, though, right? Why was it that I felt that way? I knew it made me uncomfortable to be touched so frequently, and I kind of assumed it was the same for everyone. Maybe it had to do with my upbringing or something. I couldn't remember being touched or cuddled a lot as a kid, like I said before. Maybe that's why it felt so foreign to me. I blinked. I guess I just assume that everyone else feels the same way I do. I looked to Hidose, but got embarrassed and looked away again. In terms of being touched, at least, I don't really like it. It's weird, but probably because it's uncommon for me. I lifted a hand and slowly grabbed at my arm, thinking about the sensation and comparing it to a touch from Pudupi. It wasn't that I didn't want to be touched. I did. It was just weird for me. But I guess it's not like that for Pudupi, huh? I didn't even remember what things I had said out loud versus what I kept bouncing around in my head. I just kind of mumbled out random things, so when Hidose responded, I wasn't sure what to expect. Yeah, she likes you a whole lot, and not to say that you aren't normal, but it's pretty common for people to like to be touched by their boyfriend or girlfriend, she explained, nodding. Pudopi is definitely one of those people, and I know she'd like it if you would touch her more, even just a hug or something. Also, I think it's important that you talk to Pudopi about being uncomfortable when touched. That sort of thing is important. Plus, it may help clear up some understandings about you not touching her too. The girl crossed her arms and nodded, having on a pondering expression before smiling my way. I wasn't sure if what she was saying was true and good advice, but, well, she probably knew better than me at least. You think so? I asked. Having that sort of conversation would be hard with Pudopi. I mean, how would I even bring it up? Hey, I don't touch you because people never touch me and it makes me uncomfortable and I don't really like it, but I still like you, so please don't take it personally. That just sounded weird. I also didn't want her to think that her touching me all the time made me uncomfortable, even though it did. I just didn't want her to feel bad about it, you know? It wasn't that she specifically made me uncomfortable, just receiving touch in general did. But it also felt like it was something I should overcome or get used to. For example, the time Pudopi kissed me. Under normal circumstances, I probably would have been pretty upset to be kissed like that by anyone else, but with her, it was nice, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about it often and how it felt. However, I didn't think I would want her to just come up and do it again any time, which was probably why I didn't desire to do the same to her. I do think so, Hirose nodded. She's an understanding girl, and if you're on the same page, I'm sure things will go smoothly. The girl smiled and stood up from her seat. It's important that you both are comfortable in your relationship, you know? If you talk about it, then I'm sure everything will be just fine. Maybe she was right. Pudopi didn't know what made me uncomfortable, and in the past had trouble understanding it too. But I guess I never properly communicated with her what made me uncomfortable in the first place, so how was she to know? Sure, maybe her continuing to hug on me could make her happy and maybe I'd get used to it. But if it didn't, she'd probably be more hurt to know I'd been uncomfortable the whole time. Ugh. I dug my hands into my hair and sighed. Who knew relationships would be so difficult? Anyway, I'm sorry to barge in here and bring up all of this. It's just really been eating at her lately, and I didn't want to keep letting it fester without saying something, you know? Hirose straightened up and let her smile fade. I won't interfere, though. This is your relationship, and while I'd like it if you consider some of the things I mentioned, I won't say anything or scold you for doing anything different. I was both glad she said that, but also a little disappointed. I felt like I needed help with the whole relationship thing, but it looked like it was all up to me. I hoped they didn't screw anything up, more than I already had. Yeah, thank you, I said, hands moving from my head to the back of my neck, another sigh erupting from my lips. After that, I was left by myself in the office, staring at a nearly completed order list. I needed to work harder as her boyfriend. The following day, Pudopi stopped by my apartment to hang out after school. I had the day off work, so I spent most of it prepping some new sweets while home alone. I was trying out some new recipes to possibly introduce to the cafe, but didn't want to show them to my boss until I narrowed down my selections. At the moment, I had about a dozen different sweets all laid out on the kitchen table, trying not to think of all the money I dumped on the ingredients. Some were sweet and tart, and a few were rich and creamy. I decided to try out several fruit-themed ones to take advantage of the cafe's peaking fruit dish sales too. Sitting in the kitchen, I snacked away at the different sweets, sipping some tea to see how the flavors paired with it while waiting for Pudopi to arrive. School had been out for a few hours, so she was likely to arrive any time. Runaka was working a few back-to-back shifts, so I wouldn't see him until the next day, and since I didn't know Fumi's schedule, who knew when and if I'd see her either. Before long, there was a knock at the front door, and I popped up from my seat in the kitchen to go answer it. As expected, it was Pudopi. She grinned as usual to see me, running up and throwing her arms around me in a tight embrace. Kishka! Her voice rang, her small body smashing against mine without any hesitation. The uncomfortable feeling hit me as usual, but I prompted to move past it and set a hand on her back. Hey, Pudopi, I greeted her, scooting back so I could close the door and shed away the uncomfortable temperature. It was already dark outside because of the time of year, so the sun being set didn't help the chilling weather from seeping in. The blonde smiled at me, looking up at my face and then letting go of my body to shut the door behind her. She then took off her shoes without a moment's delay.
What the heck did you make in here, Kishka? It smells so good!
Pudupi shouted out as she began to look around the apartment like a little dog who had just smelled some freshly cooked chicken. She ran into the kitchen and sniffed around the table, eyeing all the different sweets I'd made.
Whoa, did you get commissioned to bake the whole neighborhood some sweets or something?
I slowly walked after her, rolling my eyes. Of course she'd think of something silly like that. No, just testing some new recipes. I stepped up beside her and looked over my selection. I mostly ate from the heavier sweets since my sweet tooth was pretty active that evening, but overall, each batch had about 20 to 40 pieces remaining. They were small servings.
Oh.
Pudupi nodded, looking back to me. Even though I was sure she would start picking at the sweets immediately, her begging eyes seemed to say otherwise. I guess she was waiting for my okay. You can have some if you want, I said, gesturing towards the table and nodding. The girl's eyes lit up, smiling widely in reply. With that, she ran to the cupboard and pulled out a small plate and instantly started to load it up with different sweets, at least one of each kind. Once her plate was full, we made our way to the living room and sat down on the couch to relax.
So, are you nervous about the competition?
The blonde asked, shoveling a treat inside her mouth as she spoke. That was a silly question. Of course I was nervous. Anyone would be, unless they were overtly cocky. Yeah, I replied, holding a new cup of tea in my hand. The warmth of the mug left me feeling comfy and toasty. Even though I had been baking all day with the oven on, the apartment was still a bit on the chilly side, so the hot liquid helped. But I'll just do what I can and continue from there. Pudupi nodded and grinned at my response, shoveling another sweet in her mouth and sighing in satisfaction before replying.
That's the spirit, Kishka.
The blonde set the plate down in her lap, taking a break from snacking.
You'll do well no matter what, and even if you don't win, you have other competitions you can still enter down the line, right?
I nodded. She was right, but even still, if my first competition went badly, then I knew it'd be hard for me to have confidence in another one only a month later. I sighed internally. But, like I said, I'd just do what I could and go from there. We'll see, though. I could use the money regardless, so I'm just hoping I'll win, I said, yawning a little and taking a sip from my mug. Mint tea really hit the spot. I spaced out into the mug and didn't notice the front door open until Pudupi spoke up, greeting the person who entered.
Good evening, Fumi!
Pudupi beamed, picking up a cookie from her plate and eating it.
Kishka made a bunch of sweets if you want to try some.
Ah, Fumi was home. I looked up from my mug to the girl, watching her remove her shoes and readjust her bag on her shoulder that looked to be filled to the brim with books. It was tough to be a medical student, I guess. Fumi looked up at the two of us when she was greeted, smiling at both of us. Good evening, she stuttered. She moved some hair from her face to behind her ear and changed her gaze from Pudupi to me. There that feeling was again. I couldn't help but pay extra attention to how she looked from where I was. She had on some makeup, a darker red shade as eyeshadow, and a deeper red color on her lips. She was wearing a longer reddish-brown dress that went to her knees, black tights on her legs, and covering her arms was a black trench coat, unbuttoned and flowing to her sides. She looked beautiful. Hey, Fumi. I finally choked out after getting over her stunning appearance. She smiled at me more before breaking our gaze and slowly walking past us to her room. Unconsciously, I ended up watching her the whole way, seeing her hair flow from side to side. It was so long and almost reached her behind.
Kishka?
Pudupi's voice rang in my ears. Jeez, I was really spacey that day. I snapped my eyes back to the blonde girl. Huh? Oh, that's right. We were talking about things before Fumi showed up, weren't we? When I looked back to the blonde, however, she no longer had on her beaming expression and instead looked kind of upset. She stared at me for a moment before looking away slowly, her expression unchanging. Uh-oh. What was wrong? The behavior was very out of character for her, so I immediately began to worry. Hey, are you okay? I asked, leaning towards her. She didn't say anything, though. She continued to look away from me, glaring off at the ground. Hey. She was fine a moment ago. What happened? I racked my brain to try and understand. Nothing out of the ordinary happened in those past few minutes, so I wasn't sure why she was suddenly being nonverbal. I reached a hand out to touch her shoulder, trying to keep in mind what Hirose had said. Maybe she was just upset I hadn't really touched her at all yet that day. However, when my hand brushed her shoulder, she abruptly smacked it away. What? Furupi looked back at me with an angered expression. Immediately, my chest ached. I'd never seen her look like that before, and it was scary to see the normally bundle of sunshine look so upset at me.
You like her, don't you?
The blonde snapped, her little hands balling into fists, and her expression unchanging from its anger. My stomach dropped. What? Like her? Who? Oh. Oh shit. Was she referring to Fumi? If so, how did she know? I didn't tell anyone about my feelings for Fumi, and even when Runaka had made mention of it, I did my best to cover it up. Like who? I tried to play dumb. Maybe she was referring to someone else, like Hirose or something. Obviously, I didn't like her like that, but maybe Purupi heard about her visiting the cafe and thought it was something more. That was what I hoped, at least.
Fumi! Who else?
The girl huffed in a small shout, her arms crossed. Our previous lighthearted atmosphere was immediately gone. Purupi stopped touching any of the cookies on her plate, and instead was just glaring at me. Shit. She wasn't supposed to know. I started to panic. What was I supposed to do? I mean, she was right. I wanted to deny it, though, but it was probably best to be honest. After all, I guessed it was pretty obvious to her. I was staring at Fumi just moments ago, too. Maybe that's what gave it away. I stared at my lap, struggling to think of what to say. The silence didn't help the situation, though. Purupi looking to me and then looking away.
Did you lie to me?
Her tone changed from angry to hurt, and I winced at the pit growing in my stomach. Why was this happening? We were having fun just a moment ago. I didn't lie, though. Purupi must have thought I led her on, which wasn't true at all. I had never lied to Purupi about anything when it came to our relationship, but I also never said I didn't feel attracted to someone at the same time, too. And now it looked like I was paying for it. I still had yet to say anything, and I knew it was only making things worse. It was hard to come up with the right thing to say, but I had to say something. No, I stammered, leaning over to her to try and catch her gaze, but she only looked away from me. Listen, sure, I think she's really pretty and stuff, but...
Is that why you don't touch me?
Purupi's tone changed to a far more accusatory one, looking me in the eyes and narrowing hers. I could see her eyes get glossy, on the brink of tears now. It made me feel awful.
Because I'm not your type? Because I don't look like that?
My stomach continued turning over and over, and I felt sick to my stomach as she continued talking. She was making all those claims, and it terrified me more and more that she would just leave me if I didn't try and fix everything. No, it's not like that. It's just, Purupi cut me off again.
If you didn't want to be in a relationship with me, you could have said no.
Purupi raised her voice and looked to me with tears spilling from her eyes. Oh my god. She was completely misunderstanding everything, and I didn't know what I could do to fix it. She was hurting because of me. After all she'd done for me, I was over there making her cry. I racked my brain to try and think of something that would make things better while feeling like I was going to throw up. Of course I want to be in a relationship with you, I stammered. I reached a hand out to touch her arm, and this time she didn't pull away, but her muscles tensed as I touched her. It was true. I was unsure at first about where my feelings lied with Purupi, but as time went on, I really started to adore her and desire to spend time with her. Sure, I found Fumi attractive, but it didn't mean I didn't find Purupi attractive too. They were different. But no matter how many times I repeated those words in my head, the words failed to spill from my lips in the way I needed them to. It's just, I'm not comfortable with... Purupi suddenly stood up, stopping me mid-sentence yet again. Her body was shaking, and she continued to look away from my eyes.
If you're not comfortable being around me, then you should have just left me alone from the start.
She let out in anger. The regret in her voice made me want to disappear. That was it. She regretted meeting me. The person in my life who cared more than anyone, supported me more than anyone, and loved me more than anyone, was no longer thankful she met me. I wanted to curl up and disappear. How could I have messed up so badly? No, that's not what I meant. I desperately spoke to try and fix the situation, to try and change her mind and let her understand my side. But she wouldn't let me get a single word in. Pudupi continually interrupted me, and it was clear she was too upset to listen. I couldn't even blame her. From her perspective, I absolutely stabbed her in the back and gave her false hope for a relationship. She was probably heartbroken.
Then what did you mean?
Pudupi finally faced me again, her hands balled into fists at either side of her body as frustration was clear in her features once more, most especially behind her eyes.
You're always so secretive, and I thought that maybe it was because you were shy or something, but now I'm starting to think it's because you just like to toy with people. You're just playing with my feelings, and I cannot stand it!
Her words hit hard, and knowing her warped perception of me made me feel sick. Is this what she thought of me?
I've been trying so hard to see things from your perspective, and it's hard. I always feel like you have this wall up and won't ever let me through, but I guess I know why now.
Pudupi's body language slowly started to crumble into a weaker stance, tears pouring down her cheeks again. Her voice trembled as she spoke.
You never liked me to begin with.
No, this wasn't true. She was turning the whole thing into something else entirely, but I didn't know how to stop it from spiraling into even more madness. She was hurting, and I didn't even know how to stop it. Pudupi shook her head and spun around, heading towards the front door. What was I going to do? I sprung from my seat on the couch, running after her. I couldn't just let her leave like that. She might not even come back if I didn't say something then. Pudupi, wait, I called after her, standing in front of her as she tied her shoes while she cried silently. She didn't look up at me once. We should talk about it. You're misunderstanding. God damn it, Kishka. Why do you have to be so bad at communicating at the worst times? Why couldn't I just speak my mind? And you know what? That's what the problem was. The whole situation could have been avoided if I had just spoken my mind all that time. It was pathetic that I didn't even realize it up until just then, really. It was Pudupi's turn to not respond to me, as she just focused on tying up her boots and putting her gloves on. It hurt. It hurt to have someone normally so loving treat me as if I didn't exist so suddenly. Pudupi. I spoke her name in a defeated tone, not sure what else I could do. I really do like you, and I'm sorry for staring at Fumi in front of you. I'm sure that I'm going home, Kishka. She interrupted me, voice still shaking as she stood up and looked towards the door. My shoulders slumped. I guess there was nothing I could do to stop her. She wouldn't let me talk. I felt defeated. With that, Pudupi opened the front door and promptly shut it behind her without a single word. God damn it. I messed everything up. And I kept doing that. Maybe if I would have just stuck with my gut and ignored everyone from the start, stayed living with my parents, my life would have been better off than it is now. At least then I wouldn't be ruining relationships, letting my brother suffer, and letting down my whole family. Maybe I really did screw up my entire life. I stayed in my room for the rest of the evening, replaying the events from the last few hours in my head over and over again. I thought about how I could have said things differently, and regretted not handling everything better. I probably could have explained my uncomfortableness at the start. That probably would have made things simpler. I was planning on talking to Pudupi about it later that day anyway, but everything kind of fell apart at an inconvenient time. I wasn't sure if Pudupi knew Runaka and Fumi were dating. I could have mentioned it to solidify the fact that Fumi wasn't even someone I could get with if I wanted to. Of course, I wasn't trying to say that I would have dated Fumi over Pudupi if she came to me, but it was hard to be honest and also speak it out loud. Nothing I said came out the way I wanted it to, even in my thoughts. And I felt like I probably only made things worse because I couldn't properly explain my feelings in the moment. I couldn't help that I was attracted to Fumi, but I guess I could control how I acted on my feelings. Gawking at a girl I wasn't dating probably didn't make Pudupi feel very good, and that's what caused the whole thing to spiral out of control. I sighed. I am such an idiot. In addition to thinking about what I could have done better, the whole time I laid in my room, I couldn't get Pudupi's angry face out of my head. I'd never seen her so upset before. I didn't even know it was possible for her to look so angry, and the thought made me feel sick. I was the reason she was angry. I was the reason she was crying. Maybe I wasn't cut out for all this stuff after all. Every little turn kept leading to another pit to fall into. At that rate, I probably should have just given up on the bakery competition as well. I felt myself falling into a depressive state, much like a few weeks prior, so I tried to combat it by getting up from my bed to go eat some of my desserts to try and cheer up. However, when I left my room, I caught sight of Fumi, who was in the kitchen. Once she saw me, she immediately scurried off into her room without a word. She must have overheard some of the things Pudupi and I had said. Great. Just what I need. I frowned and walked into the kitchen and sat at the table, eating treat after treat until I eventually dragged myself to bed. I'm such a failure. Chapter 13. Test. The competition was only a couple of days away, and my nerves were as high as ever. Pudupi hadn't texted me at all since the other day, even after I swallowed my fear and texted her myself. As much as I wasn't surprised by it, it still left me feeling terrified that maybe that day was the last time I'd see her. That combined with the stress of the competition left me feeling crippled and like I didn't want to leave my room to do anything. But I had bills to pay and a department to run. I couldn't act like a kid and just skip out just because I felt upset. One of the hardest parts about the day was trying to act like everything was okay at work. My boss was especially attentive, and since he was going to be the one driving me to the competition a few days from then, he kept checking on me. How exciting, it's almost here! My boss laughed heartily. I frowned. I wish I could feel that carefree. He placed his hand on my back as I was preparing some fresh macarons for the oven, seemingly oblivious to my mood. At that point, I didn't even jump when he touched me since I was expecting it. However, it still made me a little uncomfortable, especially added to my mood at that time. Yeah, I mumbled, squeezing the piping bag to place some of the macaron batter onto the pan. My eyes stayed fixed on my task at hand, and I tried to keep my default expression despite how depressed I felt. I'm so proud of you for taking it head on too, Kishka. The man nodded and patted my shoulder, my body tensing so as to keep my body steady as I worked on the macarons. You're like the son I never had. Ugh. I was sure that statement was supposed to be complimenting and all, but I wasn't sure how to feel about it. Firstly, it was a strange thing to hear someone say at all, and secondly, I had felt it put a lot of pressure on me. I knew that everyone in the cafe and my friends all had high expectations of me, and I was scared I'd let them all down. It was very possible I could go and screw the whole competition up. I bit down on my lip, thinking about all the other people I'd let down the past few months alone. I could make a list. I didn't reply to my boss and finished up the last macaron before setting the piping bag to the side. I stood up straight and turned towards him, grabbing the tray. I really wanted to just focus and keep working. You got this, okay? My boss tried to encourage me, smiling my way. I couldn't even try smiling back. Yeah, maybe I got this. I nodded and slipped past him, his hand sliding off of my shoulder. I walked to the oven to pop the macarons inside, opening the door with my left hand. The heat from the machine made me flinch, but I sustained it and closed the door once the tray was in. I set a timer for the macarons and turned back around, jumping at the sight of my boss, who was right in front of me. I hadn't expected him to follow so closely after me. Kishka, you're quiet today. I'm quiet every day. He probably meant more quiet than usual. I averted my eyes, looking down while I shrugged. Yeah, was all I said, not sure what else to say. He couldn't help me with any of the issues I was having right then, and talking about it wasn't going to help. At least, not talking about it with him. I walked past my boss to the window of open orders, quickly getting started on the next ticket. I saw my boss out of the corner of my eye, but he didn't say anything else. Eventually, he left to his office, which I was thankful for. I sighed a breath of relief. He couldn't help, and I hoped he finally understood that. I guess I also could have just told him that, but communicating was even harder than usual at that point. Just responding to the waitresses was proving to be difficult. When work was over, I intended on walking home. My boss offered to drive me, but I refused. I just wanted to be alone, even if alone might not have been the best decision with my current mindset. But fortunately, or unfortunately, when I left out the cafe door to leave, Runaka was standing by the front door, looking around the area. My stomach dropped and I felt panic rise up inside me instantly. Oh no. I could only imagine why Runaka was there. Maybe Fumi mentioned something to him about me. Was I actually going to get beat up? I took a few steps back and considered leaving out the back door before he noticed me. But, as my bad luck would have it, the blue-haired man saw me shortly after I'd walked out from the kitchen and waved at me. It would be too obvious if I hid out in the back now. And if I tried to run for it, he might actually beat the shit out of me. Even though my heart was racing and I already felt sick to my stomach, there was no getting out of it, so I accepted my fate and walked across the cafe floor to the man. I had both hands on the straps to my backpack that was set against my body, feeling my palms sweat against them. I hate this. I surveyed his body language as I got closer, studying his expression and taking note of his casual demeanor. His expression looked a little more tense than usual upon closer inspection, and it made me nervous. I didn't say anything when I walked up to him, just holding onto the straps of my backpack tightly and staring at him. "Want to ride home?" he asked. I felt like I didn't have a choice in the matter, but I decided to test it anyway. I was going to walk home, I said flatly, looking away from Runaka and staring at his shoes instead. I felt like a kid who had just got caught doing something wrong. At that point, I felt like everyone in our friend circle knew about the situation, and the regret I felt was unmeasurable. My fear may not have been true, and I was probably letting my paranoia get the best of me, but I thought it was better if I just prepared myself for the worst just in case. "Oh, well, I'm already here, so let me take you home," Runaka grinned, setting his hands on his hips. I frowned, staring back downwards again. "That's okay. I can walk," I mumbled, confidence not being my selling point. Runaka clearly saw it as an opportunity to overrule me, though, putting a hand out to grab my shoulder. He shoved me into him in a half hug and chuckled. "Come on, man, it's cold. I got you." His regular chipper tone rang through my ears, and I winced at how loud it was. Yep, as I thought. No choice. I didn't hesitate and just remained silent, letting Runaka drag me out of the cafe somewhat unwillingly. We went out to his truck, and even though I probably could have run off then, I decided to just accept it and climb into the passenger side. When we got inside the vehicle, I sat my backpack on my lap, wrapping my arms around it and hugging it close to my body once I was belted in. For some reason, the embrace gave me a feeling of security. I continued to hold on to it. Runaka started up the engine without a word, and then pulled out of the cafe's parking lot. Once on the road, I just stared at my feet, my chin sitting on top of my backpack. I spaced out as I listened to the hum of the engine, letting my mind swim in a sea of thoughts. The ride back was silent, which helped calm my nerves and my paranoia about the current situation, so that was nice. You know, maybe Runaka was just in the area and thought to take me home. That was a possibility, right? Also, that sort of thing wasn't out of character for him either. Yeah, maybe that was it. When we pulled into the parking lot to our apartment, Runaka turned off his engine and yawned loudly, despite how early in the day it was. Knowing Runaka, he probably worked late the night before, or only caught a few hours of sleep. I reached to detach my seatbelt, hands slipping off my backpack, when the man's voice beside me spoke up. "I heard you and Vtuber got into a fight." I tensed at his words and stopped my hand at the latch to the belt. Ah. The wave of uneasiness came back. I kept my face stuffed in my backpack, and I didn't face my roommate. It was more comfortable to face the ground. I didn't respond and just blinked. "Is everything okay?" Runaka's voice sounded softer then, taking me by surprise. Suddenly, a familiar feeling overcame me, reminding me of a month ago when I was back at the arcade with Runaka. The concern in his voice almost made me break down crying that day. I felt a familiar wave. I didn't know what to say. Everything was not okay. In fact, things were unlikely to get much worse unless every single paranoid thought in my mind came true. I don't know. My mouth was pressed against my backpack, so it came out muffled and cracked slightly. Renaka didn't respond at first, only the sound of his body leaning forward against the wheel accompanying the now silent car. I blinked as I stared forward, trying to put words together. As I took my time, the sound of Runaka's fingers drumming against the wheel filled the car, followed by a sigh. "You should talk to me about it," Runaka said chipperly. I wondered how much he knew. Obviously, he knew that Putupi and I broke up, but I didn't want to end up spilling even more information that would cause him to hate me too. I remained silent as I thought. Come on, man. Keeping it all bottled up isn't going to make things any better. If you're worried I'll blab something to the others, then stop. Just speak your mind. Let me know what happened. I'm sure that whatever it is fixable, and I'll help you out, okay? His words made my chest ache. He was so kind to me. Ugh. My eyes continued to stare into my backpack, and then out to the car's dashboard. Fine. I think she hates me, I mumbled out. Runaka leaned my way. Sorry, man, I can't hear you. The blue man chuckled slightly. I guess I should sit up. I sat back in my seat, releasing my mouth from my backpack, but not looking Runaka's way. I think Putupi hates me, I said again, blinking slowly as my eyes stayed glued to a particular groove in the dashboard in front of me. Yeah? How come? Runaka answered simply. Here comes the hard part. What would I say to Runaka? There were several different ways I could explain it, but what was the best way? I mentally revisited my conversation with Hirose and thought about everything she had said. I should probably just be honest and explain things from the start. I sighed and opened my mouth. I haven't really had any friends before you, I mumbled, both hands on my backpack, my thumbs massaging the textured straps. I don't really know what to do in some situations, and this was so frustrating and embarrassing. To admit more of my failures out loud to another person, especially after everything over the last few months, made me feel awful. As I admitted my true feelings, I was scared Runaka would confirm my thoughts and tell me I was a terrible person after all. I kept putting the people around me through garbage situations over and over. Surely they were sick of it. Putupi was, at least. I don't know. Hirose said I should have told Putupi that kind of stuff because now she thinks I don't like her because I don't know, touch her and stuff. Runaka nodded slowly, leaning back in his seat now. He brought a hand up to his chin, stroking it. I mean, you're definitely not the touchy type. You made that pretty obvious from the start. Runaka grinned at me, and then looked back in front of him, smile fading. Kind of figured it would have been different when you got together with Putupi, though. I'm sure she probably thought so, too. It was just one of those things I didn't quite understand because of my lack of experience with people in general, I guess. To people like Runaka, my boss, touching others was a frequent occurrence, at least in the sense of back pats and hugs. For people like Putupi, it was a little less of that and more so small touches here and there. Brushing against your arm, leaning a head against your shoulder, or just barely touching your fingers. And then there was someone like me. Someone who in most situations would move out of the way so they weren't touched, purposely avoiding being in close proximity to others and almost always keeping their hands to themselves. I didn't understand the desire of wanting to touch another person, or the desire to be touched by another person to the point of being upset about it. I understood when it was more socially appropriate to touch others, thus why I did so when consoling my brother. I knew that it helped, but I still didn't completely get it. Maybe if I was in love with Putupi, I'd desire it, but we hadn't been together all that long, and aside from curiously wanting to experience kissing some more, I didn't have urges like that. Do you think you're asexual or something? Runaka asked, taking me off guard. If you aren't sexually compatible, it's okay. I'm not going to pressure you to... No, I grumbled out as quickly as I could, feeling my face heat up in embarrassment just by hearing the word sex used in any context. That isn't it at all. It's not that I didn't have any interest in explicit stuff. It was just I didn't feel comfortable thinking about doing those sort of things with another person. Imagining myself touching Putupi in any sort of way, but most especially in ways that should be behind closed doors, it felt wrong. Even if she said it was okay, it still felt like something I shouldn't do. But maybe I was projecting. I wouldn't really want Putupi to come up to me and do those sort of things to me out of nowhere. So maybe it was just something I'd have to get over. I realized that I was doing more self-reflecting than talking, so I spoke up once again. After all, no matter how much thinking I did, I didn't think I would be able to figure out how to fix the damage I'd already dealt to Putopi and I's relationship alone. I'm interested in that stuff, but I just don't normally desire to touch other people's all in any way. Context doesn't really make a difference to me. I sighed. Anyway, at this point, I think I've realized it's just a problem I need to work through. A little too late, though. When I finished speaking, I let my eyes wander to Renaka's side of the vehicle. His eyes immediately met mine, and he smiled as I caught his gaze. I glanced away for a moment before forcing myself to look back. It's never too late. Unless you really don't like her. You do, right? Renaka crossed his arms and smiled. I just blinked in response. I mean, yeah, I did. She was goofy and kind of charming. The way she was so positive and bright about everything made life interesting. There was never a dull moment around her. Of course I do. Runaka nodded. Then you'll get through this. He gave me a thumbs up of approval, a smirk set on his features. Even though he'd said that, the guilty feeling in my gut never once left. What I mentioned wasn't the problem at hand. My eyes lowered down, looking at Runaka's torso instead of his eyes. I could still feel his gaze on me, but I didn't look back up. Something else happened. I forced out of my lips. As much as I didn't want to admit my feelings for Fumi to him, I knew it'd be better if I did, and that he heard it from me than from anyone else. I already admitted it to one person already, so what was one more, right? Damn, this was harder than I thought. Fumi... Renaka looked my way with her raised eyebrow. I've kind of had a crush on her, and I was staring at her and Putopi noticed, so I trailed off. My eyes looking further and further down until I started to turn my head to the side to avoid the blue-haired man's gaze. I felt ashamed. Runaka sensed my discomfort instantly, and he softly set his hand on one of mine. At the touch, I immediately felt the necessity to look back at him. Runaka still had on his usual smile. You already knew. I felt the need to ask. He didn't look upset at all. Pretty much, he nodded. The other man returned his hand to his side, stretching out his legs and yawning. I mean, you made it pretty obvious you had a thing for her when I told you about us getting together. Ugh. I tried to blow it off that day, but I guess I didn't do that great of a job. I frowned. Still, eyeing her after getting with Putopi, though? Runaka gave me a pitiful smile and shook his head and his index finger at me in a scolding way. My girl is great, but you have to consider how Putopi feels, you know? With that, Runaka raised one of his legs up into his seat, sitting cross-legged and completely facing me. After all, if, say, you had an even bigger crush on Shoto and you two finally started dating, if she kept looking at me every time I showed up, wouldn't that kind of piss you off? Oh. I never thought about it like that. That would make me pretty upset. I blinked at the realization, looking down again. You really messed up, man. Runaka laughed before stopping and leaning down to catch my gaze. I looked at him, watching his expression change from humored to more serious. But again, you could fix it. He smiled. But you got some apologizing to do. He was right. I messed up in more ways than one, and I needed to fix it. Oh, and maybe don't check out my girlfriend anymore? Runaka grinned wider, lowering his eyebrows and putting out an arm to rustle my hair. She's great, but you got a little cutie on your hands. Don't let her get away from you. Once he was done making a mess of my hair, I lifted a hand to replace the strands that covered my eyes. He was right. If I liked Putopi so much, I really had to get over Fumi and focus on Putopi instead. Jeez, why was I such an idiot? My eyes met Runaka's again, and I offered him a small smile. Honestly, it was the biggest I could muster at the time. Thank you, Runaka, for everything. Without him, I had no idea what I would have done. He had always been there for me and never asked anything in return at all. It didn't feel fair. But, well, I had also never offered, so maybe that was it. I should start doing that. If there's anything I can do, let me know, okay? I'd like to return the favor if that's even possible at this rate. Urnaka laughed in response. Well, if you keep your eyes off of Shoto and keep paying rent on time, I'll be a happy guy. The blue-haired man nodded and removed his feet from off the seat, grabbing his keys and looking to me one last time. Come on, let's go inside. It was the last day of the competition, and I had yet to hear back from Pudapi at all. I'm going to start that sentence over. I completely read that wrong. It was the day of the competition, and I had yet to hear back from Pudapi at all. I texted her to say I was sorry and even tried to call her, but she never responded. I wasn't going to give up on reaching out to her, but I had to put the situation on hold for the time being. Otherwise, I'd be in no position to compete at all that day. My nerves were a wreck. I was anxious and mad at myself for making things the way that they were with Pudapi, and to top it all off, I was then surrounded by a dozen other patisserie chefs, who were likely way more capable than I was. I had to try and accept that I couldn't resolve things just yet and focus on the competition instead, but that was already proving to be difficult. The bakery competition was being held in a small ballroom inside a Tokyo hotel and was hosted by a panel of judges and sponsored by a popular bakery utensil brand. The company even supplied us with everything we needed to use for our desserts that day. The judges were two professionals who worked within the field, a famous patisserie professor and an owner of a large cafe brand. Next to the judges were a few photographers and journalists who were also there to document and write about the event. It was exciting, but also nerve-wracking to know that the journalists could say anything about me in their articles after the event. I really hope I won't embarrass myself. In addition to those people, there was a small crowd of spectators off to the sidelines. Among them was my boss, sitting in the front row, along with representatives from a few of the other chefs who were there competing as well. It was then that I took the time to get a good look at my competitors. Most of them looked pretty serious, calm, and collected, which made me feel better about the way I held myself outwardly. At the very least, my default expression would blend in. Speaking of appearances, that day I wore my usual cafe attire, since it was fitting for the event, which was a long-sleeve button-up, slacks, and the apron Pudapi had gifted me. Everyone else in the room was dressed similarly, with a few exceptions here and there, but nothing that stood out too much. There was quite a variety of ages among all the competitors, though. Off in the corner of the room were two girls, one of which had on a fair amount of makeup, while the other girl next to her didn't have much on at all. They were talking to one another, so I got the feeling they were friends. One of the girls had light brown hair and wore a giant smile on her face, which was contrasting to the girl next to her, who had black hair and a scowl on her face. Next to them was a small child who looked only a few years older than Riedna. Despite his age and small height, he had on a determined expression, which impressed me. Some of the other people in the room were adults who were quick to spark up conversation with one another once they had arrived. They all held themselves highly in terms of body language, back straight and chests out. I got the feeling that they were a little big-headed because of that, so I hoped it would be their downfall. A large chunk of the rest of the competitors looked about my age, if not a little older, and mostly kept to themselves as we waited to start the competition. Nothing interesting really happened among them. Lastly was another young competitor, a small girl. She looked a little nervous, but every time she looked overwhelmed, she looked back at a lady, who was probably her mother, on the sidelines. The woman would smile, and the young girl would nod and look forward again. It happened often. Cute. Subconsciously, I looked back to where my boss sat and was greeted with a smile and away from the man almost immediately. I felt a smile tug at the corner of my mouth. That's right. No matter what happened, he was there for me. He wanted me to succeed, and I had to make him proud. I looked back in front of me and looked over my competitors again. No matter what happened that day, I'd learn from the experience and use it to better myself and do better at the next competition. The competition began about an hour later, each of us given a small area with all the necessary tools to make our sweets. Among those, each station had a small stovetop and oven that were connected to a mobile counter with a drawer full of said utensils and the likes. We had exactly 1 hour to prepare, create, and dish our creations, so the pressure was on and the air was tense as everyone awaited the start. A whistle blew moments later, alerting us that our timer started. Immediately, the sounds of utensils clashing against one another and items being ripped open filled the room. I stayed focused on my area, quickly getting immersed in my task. The outside world began to fade, and before long, I couldn't even see what was going on around me, focusing solely on my creation process. I picked up some cherries and began to remove the stems and seeds, scooting the nearby trash can closer by using my foot. Once that was done, I worked on peeling and slicing a few apples and then quickly tossed the fruit with some spices and sugar. It was then that I buttered a circular dish and then laid the fruit inside. Next, I worked on the cake. Mixing together butter and sugar, I blended the two well and then folded in the flour and the remainder of the cake ingredients. I poured it into the dish, followed by the fruit. I was particular about how everything was placed, since it really did make a difference in the end, so I wasted no effort in making everything look as perfect as I needed it to. Finally, I poured the remainder of the cake batter on top and sprinkled on some cinnamon and clumped brown sugar. I then popped the dish into the preheated oven and began the plating prep. We were allowed to bring our own plating dish, so I chose one I was especially fond of from the cafe. It was a fancy glass plate with teal flowers and lace engraved on the edges. The pearl white glass complemented my dish very well, especially in photographs I'd taken, so I was excited to present it to the judges once completed. I set my plating dish on the counter and promptly started to clean up my area while waiting for my crumble cake to cook. My mind began to wander as I cleaned, since I had little left to prepare until the cake was finished baking. As my surroundings faded into my senses, I took note of all the people cheering from the sidelines. Most of the cheering went out to the younger chefs, but the fact it was happening at all made me feel nostalgic. I couldn't quite remember why at first. I stared out into the crowd of spectators, glancing over at my boss. Ah, that's right. The last time I remembered being surrounded by others during a competitive task was the time that Putupi had called out my name several times in the school gym, embarrassing me. I frowned. If not for me, she could have been there on the sidelines, rooting me on again. Maybe not as loudly, but at least there to support me. I was the one who ruined that, though. I looked back to my area and then up at the timer. The competition was wrapping up, so there is no time to get gloomy. I had to focus. I cleared off the counter space and nearly jumped as my own personal timer went off for the oven. I quickly switched it off and pulled out my cake, setting it on top of the stove to cool. I had to wait for it to cool, so I took that time to take a look at my competitors. Half of them were nearly done, while the other half still looked like they had a decent amount of work left to do. Looking to my right, the young kid that reminded me of my brother had a phenomenal-looking dish, working with a few different kinds of chocolate and ganache. It was really impressive for his age, and I almost felt bad to be competing against him since it didn't feel fair. Among other kids, he would have blown them all away, but he was competing against adults. Looking behind me, the girl who was wearing the heavy makeup was hard at work on her dessert, and for good reason. It looked beautiful. She already finished most of it, but now was putting on the final touches. In front of her was a dish holding several rose-shaped biscuits, each of them twisted and cut in a fancy way. Apple and strawberry slices danced around the brim of her plate, and she slowly drizzled chocolate across the edge, making little designs along the way. It was honestly stunning, and I kind of regretted turning back to my own dessert. I know I probably shouldn't have compared myself to the others, especially in the context of a competition, but I still felt like my presentation looked especially messy and unimpressive in comparison. I frowned and leaned forward, poking at the side of the dish to check the temperature. It was almost cool enough. I looked up at the timer for the event that was projected on a big screen at the front of the room. I winced. I was running out of time. I felt myself start to panic a little, concerned thoughts entering my stressed mind. What if I couldn't plate it in time? If I took the cake out of its pan early, the whole thing would fall apart. It would look awful. I frowned. As I stood there staring at my empty plating dish, arms out to either side of me, I started to think about Putupi. I miss her. If she were here, she'd be rooting for me every step of the way and supporting me on the sidelines. My head tilted downwards, and I stared at the ground as I started to feel emotional. I really did miss her, and the thought of her not being there because of my actions really stuck with me. I couldn't ignore it no matter how hard I tried. The feeling of wanting to cry came over me suddenly. I sighed. Have I always been this weak by myself? I depended on so many people, and I hadn't realized how much I'd really miss them if they weren't in my life until just then. If Rinaka wasn't there anymore, or Puropi, or even Fumi or Hirose, they all added to my life in a way that I didn't want to go away. And yet, Puropi was already on her way out because of me and my selfishness. My arms shook as I struggled not to break down. No. Get yourself together, Kishka. You're in public, surrounded by strangers and cameras. One of the last things you should be doing is crying at your first competition before even submitting your entry. Taking a deep breath in and then out, I looked back at my cake that sat on the stove. By then, it should have been cool enough. Hopefully. Carefully, I lifted it out of its dish and onto a cutting board I sat on the countertop. The transfer was perfect. Then, I took out some utensils and cut off a slice, carefully setting it down on a plate. Once set, I turned back to the stove and set down my utensils. However, in doing so, my side hit the plate slightly and the dish slid off the counter. It fell onto the floor and quickly shattered into several pieces. My slice of cake bounced off of the plate and slid across the floor in my section, making an even bigger mess. No. My stomach dropped immediately, watching as many heads turned in my direction at the sound of my broken dish. Ugh, of course this would happen to me. My bad luck drawing wasn't for nothing, I guess. And there is a photo for this section. My body trembled as I felt the stares of multiple people in the room on me, their attention leaving me and feeling incredibly anxious. God, stop looking at me. On top of that, I was embarrassed and immediately frustrated at my mishap. My plating dish was destroyed, and there was only a couple of minutes left until the timer went off, and the competition came to a close. I was screwed. The feeling of wanting to cry came over me once more, and I instantly wanted to run away and hide to escape the situation. I kept trying to tell myself to calm down and that it would be okay, but my logical thoughts were quickly drowned out by ones full of despair and negativity. How could I even recover from this? Would I even place at this rate? I was going to be seen as a joke. I squatted down to pick up the pieces of my shattered plate off the ground, trying to take deep breaths in and out to stabilize my mood, but it was incredibly difficult. Tears ran down my cheeks and my arms shook as my hands collected the shards. This was it for me. I'd tarnished my only saving grace to the weak and couldn't even muster up the strength to keep pushing forward. I just wanted to disappear.
Emochi!
I blinked.
Go, go, Emochi!
A familiar voice entered my ears. Ah, these were the words Purupi had chanted that day. I blinked at the ground, tears falling from my lashes and into my hands. Did I really miss her so much that I was hallucinating her voice? I frowned and sighed.
You got this, Emochi!
I stood up, sliding the broken plate in the trash and looking to the sidelines. Of course, Purupi wasn't there. Only my boss, who looked worried on my behalf. I looked away. I was stressed to the point of imagining Purupi there to cheer me. Somehow, I wasn't even surprised. I sighed and looked to my dessert, trying to decide what to do. Maybe I'll just forfeit. I barely had any time left, and I didn't have the energy to try and plate it again.
Emochi, what are you doing? Keep going!
The voice came again. My chest ached, knowing it was only my imagination toying with my feelings. Something inside me hoped, prayed it was real. And even though I knew there wasn't anyone there, I turned around and looked back to the sidelines, searching the rows. I frowned. She still wasn't there. I started to slump over and,
You got this, Emochi! I believe in you!
Puropi? I looked in the direction of the voice, which was a few feet away from where the rest of the people sat on the sidelines. And there she was. Puropi Kikamura. I felt my chest ache once more. She came. She actually came. But why? After what I put her through and how inconsiderate to her feelings I was, she still came all this way. To cheer me on? At that point, the girl had been yelling my way for some time now, so it appeared she was getting scolded by a few of the staff. However, once I looked her way, she immediately caught my gaze and beamed. She put up 2 thumbs up, enthusiastically thrusting them back and forth in the air before being dragged off by staff. I sniffled some more, feeling emotional still, but not in the same sense as before. Putupi was still there for me. Suddenly, I felt a lot less lonely. That's it. I couldn't let her down now. I didn't have much time before the end of the competition, but I probably had enough time to finish what was left. I opened a drawer at my station and pulled out a plain white dish and cut another piece from my dessert, placing it on the dish. There was only 30 seconds left on the timer, so I quickly finished my plating, sprucing it up as I'd originally planned, with more cinnamon on top, as well as some honey and a mint leaf on the edge of the plate. Just as I finished a design made with honey on the corner of the dish and on top of the dessert, the whistle blew, alerting all the competitors that the time was up and to set down their utensils. I threw up my arms and stood back from my station. I made it. Just barely. But I made it. As I stood with my arms up, slowly lowering them, I listened to my breathing slow to a normal rate and felt my body temperature lower. I hadn't expected the competition to be such an emotional roller coaster, but there I was. Once time was up, there was a small waiting period before each competitor was invited up to the panel of judges to present their dish. I was one of the last for presentation, so to distract myself from my nerves, I focused on what I would say to Putupi afterwards. Since she was dragged out, I had no idea where she was right then, but regardless, I was absolutely going to find her and apologize. When it was my turn to meet the judges, I set my dish down in front of them, expression neutral as always. I watched them look over every detail of the dessert, them each taking turns spinning the plate around, nodding and reacting to the look of my creation. After that, they each took up a clean fork and took a piece from it. One after another, they took a bite and chewed it. And as if I was in the cafe, each of their faces lit up, small smiles appearing on their faces. They chewed away, a few of the judges making amused or happy noises and nodding their head. I was tempted to smile at their reactions, but thought it'd be best to suppress the urge. I didn't want to appear too simple to please. But maybe that was my paranoia overthinking things. Once they consumed enough of my piece, they dismissed me. I then walked back over to my boss, who was sat in the seating area and on the sidelines. We wouldn't know the results of the competition until after the judges deliberated, which was estimated to take another half hour. So, in the meantime, we were allowed to mingle and speak with others, so long as we didn't leave the premises. Once I walked up to my boss, he greeted me by embracing me in a tight hug, nearly squeezing the air out of me. Ugh, I grumbled out before I was let free from his embrace. My boss then grabbed me by the shoulders and smiled. His big, proud eyes looked into mine, and I could have sworn they teared up a little as he looked at me. "I'm so proud of you, Kishka," he said with a huge grin. His hands squeezed at my shoulders, and he held himself back from giving me another hug. Instead, he took his hands off of me and plopped them on his hips. "You did a great job out there. And with that sort of entry, they're sure to fall in love with you." The man nodded several times in a row before looking to me with his default grin, waiting for me to respond. I nodded in reply. Thanks was all I could think to say. I, of course, hoped that the judges liked my dish, but I wasn't going to get my hopes high. After seeing all the others present their dishes, it looked like a tough decision. No doubt, they were some skilled patisserie chefs under our roof. I took a seat on a nearby chair, my boss sitting next to me. It was quiet between us, only the sounds of other participants chattering to fill the air. Since we weren't talking, I took the opportunity to pull my phone out of my apron pocket. I was delighted to see that I had a text from Putupi.
"You got this, Kishka. Don't give up. You're doing great." Smiley face. "I'll see you later, okay?"
Heart.
"Keep your head high."
I felt my heart flutter at her kind words. I was still in disbelief that she was rooting me on all that way, despite everything. I smiled at her words, looking them over again and again. I felt like I should have texted something back to her, but I wasn't sure what was appropriate. Also, even if I did, the results were being announced soon after, so I didn't want to leave her hanging. In the end, I decided to just text her after the competition was over. Putting away my phone, I turned to my boss, who already had his eyes on me. I raised an eyebrow at him. The man laughed. "That's one heck of a girlfriend you've got," he chuckled. He must have noticed me smiling at my phone, or, I don't know, the girl yelling earlier. It was kind of embarrassing, but I wasn't going to deny anything that wasn't untrue at that point. She was my girlfriend, and I was lucky to have her. Yeah, I replied, nodding and looking away. The grin returned to my lips as I thought about Pudupi again. She's great. All of the competitors and I stood in a line in front of the judges, photographers surrounding us. It was time to announce the winners of the competition. The first place winner would receive 500,000 yen, and the second place winner would receive 100,000 yen. Both would be awarded a set of utensils and pans from the event's sponsor, which I wasn't aware of until just then. They were great quality, so it excited me and the other competitors at the news. I stood there, hands to either side of me and eyes facing straight ahead. I was really nervous, but mostly scared. Scared all of my hard work was in vain. Scared I'd let down my boss and Pudupi. I just hoped to place it all. Taking a deep breath in and then out, I watched as one of the judges, a famous patisserie chef, picked up a microphone to speak into it. He cleared his throat and then grinned. We had some amazing participants in this year's competition. I want to first off thank all of you for entering with your skillful creations. It was an absolute pleasure to try a piece of your work. The man smiled, looking around the room to all the competitors. Of course, there was only a total of 2 winners today, but fear not. Just because you did not place does not mean there isn't a role for you in your suites out there. The man grinned in a wholesome way. He paused for a moment before continuing. Now, without further ado, we shall congratulate our runner-up winner. My stomach began churning, and I balled up both of my hands into fists as I nervously awaited his answer. Keto Takamichi. Ah. I was disappointed to hear a name that wasn't mine, my hands loosening at the announcement. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the light brunette female jump up and down, shaking her dark-haired friend in excitement. I shut my eyes and let out a sigh. Okay, so I don't win second place. No big deal. I just win first place, right? I frowned. Yeah, right. It felt pretty unlikely. Congratulations, Karo. Now on to our first place winner. The man readjusted his standing position and placed a hand on his hip. Again, this was a hard decision, but the whole board was able to agree on... Deep breaths, Kishka. Deep breaths. Kishka Mochi! The man called out my name in a practiced tone, and at first, I didn't even register that he had said my name at all. Ah? My eyes stared at the man, looking him over before his eyes met with mine, followed by a smile. Congratulations! And with that, the man continued to ramble off his thank yous and other rehearsed phrases. To be honest, I stopped listening most of the way through. I was still in shock. I did it. I did it. I actually won. A small smile tugged on my lips. I did it. Shortly afterwards, the winners were instructed to come to the judges' table to confirm their information since the prizes were shipped to our homes. Of course, I and the Karu girl did as we were asked, and before long, we were dismissed. Once I was no longer on the main floor, my boss ran up to me and embraced me in yet another hug, showering me with praises and congratulatory language. It was nice. It felt good, but all I could think about was Pudupi. I had to find her. After I spoke with my boss and insisted upon taking a train home, I called Pudupi and we agreed to meet at a restaurant that was near the hotel the event was held at. My boss was pretty resistant on letting me leave without an easier ride home, but I assured him I would get back just fine. After agreeing to text him once I arrived safely, he finally let me leave. The place the blonde and I agreed to meet was your typical Japanese chain, offering a little bit of everything. Nothing fancy. I entered the storefront and met with Pudupi almost immediately, her waiting for me in the entryway. I tensed a little at seeing her, still feeling uneasy about the previous situation. After all, we didn't resolve anything yet. However, the girl didn't look tense in the slightest and walked up to me, grabbing my hand.
Congratulations, Kishka!
She grinned, her small, slender fingers squeezing mine. The fact that she was already so kind to me made me feel conflicted. I was both so happy and also filled with regret. I didn't deserve to be treated so well when I hadn't even properly apologized yet. Thanks, I stammered, eyes looking into hers before dropping my gaze and focusing on her touch. Once I'd done so, she pulled her hands away and then spun back around to face an associate to the establishment. We got ourselves a table, sitting at a booth in the middle of the restaurant. When we were both sat, Pudupi started looking through the menu. To be honest, my nerves were twisted in all sorts of ways that I didn't even feel hungry. However, I was pretty tired, so I decided to settle for a coffee. Setting down the menu in front of me, I looked over the blonde. Distance makes the heart grow fonder, is how the phrase went, right? You never know what you have until it's gone was another one. Call me cheesy and emotional for thinking those things, but after that day, those are the only things I could think of when I looked at Pudupi. She came back for me even though I didn't deserve it. She always kept coming back no matter what. I looked over the girl's blonde locks, which I noticed had grown a fair bit since I met her. Her hair draped down parts of her back and spilled over her shoulders now. As Pudupi looked through the menu, her eyes were widened and sparkled with excitement, and I could feel her kicking her legs under the table as she looked at her food options. No matter how I looked at it, Pudupi and I were polar opposites, and yet I found myself so drawn to her. Maybe it was the difference that intrigued me. I couldn't comprehend why she did some of the things she did, so perhaps that was what left me so curious. Pudupi noticed me looking her way, our eyes meeting, and her smile widening. She then looked away again to the menu, humming quietly and rocking her head side to side. Soon after that, our orders were taken, and so were our menus, leaving only the blonde and I at the table. With nothing to distract us, I felt the pressure, and a little anxiety crept up my body and back down. I had to apologize. Even though she looked fine, I owed it to her. Deep breath in, and then out. I want to apologize to you, I spoke up, raising an arm up to the back of my neck where I nervously scratched at it. I watched Pudupi's expression unchanging, still a default smile upon her lips. I'm not really good at talking about stuff, and I know that's not an excuse for putting you through everything, but I took a deep breath, lowering my gaze. Talking was so difficult. I wanted to tell you that I was sorry and wanted to explain things so maybe I wouldn't hurt you again. I knew that I'd likely end up hurting her again in the future, if for no other reason than how different the two of us functioned. But I at least wanted to do my best to avoid that from happening, if possible. Pudupi smiled my way, nodding and setting her elbows on the table, placing her chin against the palms of her hand.
It's okay, Kishka. I said some pretty hurtful things that day, too.
Her smile faded, her eyes looking down at the table, and then back up.
But let's talk it out. I don't want us to end on such a sour note, you know?
The girl smiled again, leaning her head to the side. Despite how nervous I felt, I couldn't shake the thought of how cute my girlfriend looked, even then. As if that wasn't the worst time for admiration, though, I nodded back to her. Yeah, I replied. I then went on to explain my feelings about everything. I told her about my issues with physical touch and how it'd take me a while to overcome it, but I was still okay with moving forward if she was willing to take it slow with me. I also explained my feelings for Fumi and how they weren't anything past surface level, and how she was also dating Renaka. Pudupi seemed to take all the news pretty well, which was kind of surprising considering how she reacted the first time. But I guess I wasn't checking out another girl right in front of her, so that probably helped diffuse any anger. And I know it was really stupid and inconsiderate of me to stare at another person like that, and right in front of you too. I'm really, really sorry, and I won't do it again. At my words, Pudupi only beamed, which made me feel confused. Did I say something funny? Or maybe I phrased something weird. Unnerved by her expression, I frowned. What? Pudupi then began to giggle, lowering her arms down onto the surface of the table. She blinked a few times before smiling wider.
It's nothing, it's just...
She giggled again, leaning back in her seat.
I just can't believe I was so worried about all this stuff to the point of yelling at you.
She shook her head and sighed.
After that night, I talked with Dodona about it, and she told me about the conversation you two had. I felt pretty silly for making such wild assumptions about you.
Pudupi's eyes fell to the table, her fingers tracing an invisible design onto it. So Hidose did end up saying something after all? That was probably what really saved me. I'd have to thank her later.
It made sense why...
It made sense why you came to such a conclusion, though. I may not understand your point of view, but I can understand what it might feel like to be put in your position back then. I spoke. Renaka was to thank for my understanding. If not for him as well, I might have never understood why she got so mad in the first place. Pudupi smiled.
Thank you for trying to understand me.
The girl really did look thankful, her smile beaming my direction once again. It felt good to have resolved the situation. It especially felt good to have her looking at me like that again, with happiness and joy. My chest ached, but in a good way. I missed this. It was then that Pudupi's food was delivered and my coffee was as well. I got a simple iced espresso, but doused plenty of sugar inside to dull the bitter taste. Pudupi only giggled at my actions.
Anyway, we should talk about more stuff too,
Pudupi said a little quieter, picking up her chopsticks and grabbing a piece of her food, which was katsudon, pork cutlet with a bowl of rice. I looked at her without saying anything, slowly sipping at my cold beverage. It took me a moment, but I somehow managed to understand what she was getting at.
I don't want to make you uncomfortable or unhappy when we hang out, so I'd like to figure something out, you know?
The girl continued to look at her food as she spoke, which kind of amused me. It seemed as if she was more embarrassed and shyer about that stuff than I was. If it wasn't clear enough yet, Pudupi definitely seemed to be referring to more touchy stuff. I nodded slowly. I appreciated her consideration that she always had for me, but with that, I don't know exactly how to approach this kind of thing. This is new to me, you know? I've never had a girlfriend. I glanced down at my coffee, now feeling like the embarrassed one. Pudupi, on the other hand, only smiled. I cleared my throat and looked away from her smile, unsure what it meant, and continued to speak. I think I'll get used to it all eventually, but if there's anything I'm not okay with, I'll mention it. I'd have to try and be better about voicing my thoughts if I wanted things to be smooth sailing, so no matter how difficult it felt, I'd have to just get over it and try.
If you're sure, Kishka.
Pudupi took a bite of her food, chewing away before she spoke up again.
It's important to me that you're comfortable and happy, you know?
Me too. I nodded and looked at her as she took another bite of her food, grinning when our eyes met again. This fuzzy feeling inside. Even though I had spent so much time being stressed and upset, it felt as if it had never even happened with how nice it felt now. I smiled down into my coffee before taking a sip.
Anyway, I forgive you and stuff, so let's move on to a more exciting topic. You won after all, Kishka.
The blonde brushed her forgiveness off as nothing, even though it was kind of a big deal. She made it pretty obvious that she forgave me by the way she interacted, but hearing the words gave me closure. Either way, the topic was back onto me, and the reality of actually getting first place continued to sink in. Oh, yeah, I guess I did. I shrugged, setting my coffee back down onto the table.
I knew you would! You always do an amazing job, and today proved that!
Pudupi giggled and took another bite of her food. I looked over her smiling face. It's stuffed with fried pork, and felt a smile grow on my lips. Thanks, I mumbled. It was all thanks to you. At my words, the girl raised an eyebrow, swallowed her food, and quickly gulped down a bunch of water.
Huh? I wasn't doing anything but causing a commotion.
Pudupi laughed.
I'm surprised you didn't yell at me, to be honest. But you looked a little spaced out, so I was hoping to get you back on track.
The girl placed her little arms on her hips and smiled a toothy grin. Yeah, I was spacing out, but you really did help, so thank you. I couldn't look her in the eyes as I spoke, but feeling a little awkward to speak so honestly about my feelings. But I knew I had to start doing it more, especially if it made her happier. Pudupi's smile widened at my words, and she burst into another fit of giggles.
Kishka, you're so cute!
She cooed, placing both her hands on her cheeks as she bounced in her seat. I felt my face blush in embarrassment, and I looked away from the table entirely, staring off into the restaurant instead. I don't know how that makes me cute, I grumbled. What did I even say that was cute? I was just being honest.
Well, I'm glad I helped.
Pudupi giggled, setting her hands back down.
I want to help you as much as I can, so let me know if there's anything I can do.
I nodded. It was kind of her to say so, even though she usually did without even being asked anyway. I should probably offer the same as well. I scratched at the back of my neck and looked at her. Me too. If there's something you need, you can ask me too, I mumbled. It felt weird to say. It's not that I didn't want the responsibility, but I just expected others to know it already without having to say it. But, well, they can't really read my mind. I had to speak it, despite how weird it felt. Pudupi smiled and nodded.
Thank you, Kishka.
Her words were soft and appreciative, which almost instantly made me feel good for saying what I did. I picked up my cup and took a sip of my beverage, staring out at the girl as she broke her gaze on me and began eating once again. Things somehow managed to work out, and I couldn't be more grateful to have such kind and understanding people in my life. Chapter 14. Closure. Let's hear it for Kishka! The sound of my boss's booming, excited tone filled the cafe air, reaching the ears of every associate nearby. He and I stood in front of all of my coworkers, the spotlight put on me for my competition victory. My boss made sure to praise me in front of everyone, me being his pride and joy. My face heated up in embarrassment as the room was then filled with clapping. Congratulations, each of them said, smiling at me. As much as I hated all the attention, I forced myself to try and enjoy it, since it was all for a good reason. I did it. I didn't let anyone down, and instead made everyone proud. I deserved this, or so I tried to convince myself. Once everyone had let up on their clapping, I took a deep bow. Thank you so much, everyone. I spoke out, head down and arms to my side. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm thankful I didn't let you down. My words came off a little stiff in my delivery, but I tried my best to keep a respectful tone regardless. I didn't want others to think I was big-headed and unappreciative after all. A pat came on my back from my boss, rocking my balance so that I had to stand up straight again to prevent from toppling over. I looked up to him, meeting a smiling face. I know a good kid when I see one. Of course you didn't let us down. His hand wrapped around my shoulder and squeezed my side. I smiled. Thanks, I replied, not sure what else to say. I held his gaze for a moment before looking away. I felt all tingly and happy. It was so strange to feel that way, especially in front of so many people. I ordered food for all of you guys in celebration, so once it gets here, have at it. We have an amazing team here full of amazing opportunities, and I don't want you guys to forget it. My boss's laugh filled the cafe once more, his hand releasing from my shoulders before pressing against the small of my back. But go ahead and start prepping for the day in the meantime, team. Gishka and I have a few things to go over beforehand. I looked to the man, raising an eyebrow. Did we? I wasn't sure what he was referring to. The rest of the staff quickly hurried off to work, while my boss led me to his office. I sat down in his chair across from the desk as usual, while he spun around to his side, his side of the desk, not yet sitting down. I lost my place. He still had on a childlessly excited expression, looking me up and down. My eyebrow raised further, curious as to what it was he was so happy about. So, the other competition coming up is next month. Are you entering? The question came as a surprise to me, mostly since I'd only just completed the first competition not even a week prior. Was I really ready for another one so soon? I was considering skipping the next one, so I didn't get in over my head. My boss caught my surprise somehow, even though my expression didn't change at all. Come on, Kishka! You weren't going to take advantage of it? Well, there's no telling if I'd win or not, I mumbled in reply, trying to change the direction of his question. He laughed. Oh, come on, winner or not, you could totally win. It's a great opportunity and chance for you to get more experience. The man sat down in his chair. Plus, you remember the prize, right? Actually, no. I didn't. He told me about it some time ago and forwarded the email to me, but with everything that had been going on lately, I completely forgot what it was. I shook my head. My boss shook his finger at me, leaning back in his seat. Come on now, how could you forget? He laughed again, and I only frowned. But not because I was sour about it. I just really couldn't remember. The winner of the competition gets to be a part of a free mentoring program with the Hachiyama. My ears perked up Toruno Hachiyama was an Okinawa-based patisserie chef that became well known for his delicate crepes and intricate and decorative pancakes. I'd read a lot of articles about him, and he usually didn't do mentoring from what I knew, so to hear he was offering such a thing, I was interested. Oh, I replied. Maybe I should then. I thought out loud, staring down at his desk. If he could teach me how to master the techniques he used, it could really be a game changer. It would also make the cafe that much more valuable if we had that level of detail in our desserts. Good, good. You should, my boss echoed me, turning his eyes to his computer to type away. His eyes scanned the screen, clicking a few times before smiling. Here. The man turned the screen to face me, and I blinked, adjusting my eyes to the difference in brightness. On the screen was an email listing all the details of the event. It was another competition, but was focused around making an original bakery dish using limited ingredients and a time limit. The entrants were allowed to plan out what they would be making beforehand, but the recipes had to be submitted and approved before the competition itself. I nodded as I read. It looked like there would only be one winner, and they would walk away with a mentorship program, or mentorship with Hachiyama, which would last 3 months. Wow. 3 entire months. If I win, though, I mumbled, before my boss cut me off, then the cafe will be here waiting for you when you get back, he replied, no falter in his smile. I opened my mouth to protest, but the man was having nothing of it. I was having none of it. I want you to have this opportunity, Kishka. You deserve this kind of opportunity, and I will do whatever I can to make sure you keep succeeding in this field no matter what. Wow. His words got me feeling emotional instantly, and my eyes stayed fixed on him as I struggled to think of what I could say. Thank you? Thank you was the only word I could think of, but it didn't feel like it was enough. Thank you so much, I managed out, eyes lowering. It wasn't good enough, but it would have to do. I blinked. Why did everyone seem to like me so much? My eyes became misty and I blinked a few tears away. I don't know how to repay you for everything, I spoke earnestly. My boss then laughed loudly once more and stood up. He walked to my side and put a hand on my shoulder, shaking me a little. Again, keep doing what you love and bring me a few new faces in here and I'll be the happiest man alive. The man smiled down at me while I looked up to him with my tear-tickled lashes. I hoped he wouldn't notice them. I nodded and smiled in return. Of course, I said in confidence. The day progressed, and after my shift was over, Purupi joined me on the walk home. She was wearing some overalls with a light orange jacket on top and a scarf. Nothing too heavy since the temperature had been better as of late.
Wow, they threw a party for you?
Purupi reacted as one would expect, however exaggerated that morning's celebration a little. I'm not sure I could call it a party, I mumbled, but just shrugged.
That's so cool! Your coworkers probably love you now. Everyone got free food because you rock!
Purupi giggled, swinging her arm to her side before slowing her hand to embrace mine. I wasn't wearing gloves that day, so the sudden cold, fleshy feeling made me jump a little. Purupi loosened her embrace and looked up to me with concern lacing her features.
Oh, sorry, Kishka.
She apologized, a small smile on her lips. I smiled back. It's okay, I replied, and grabbed her hand with mine, our embrace tightening. It wasn't that I didn't want to hold her hand. I was just startled was all. At the touch, the girl smiled wider and then looked back in front of her as we walked.
Anyway, I'm glad to hear that you're going to do the other one too. It should be a lot of fun, and when you win,
the girl smirked,
you'll have to let me be the first one to try out your new techniques.
As we walked, the blonde swung her arm, the one that wasn't busy with mine, side to side. Sure. Sure. I decided not to argue with her about it, since it wouldn't really solve anything. Also, I'd won the last competition, so maybe there was a chance I'd win another one too. A small silence broke between us, and neither of us said anything for a little while. I let my mind wander. Instead of thinking about myself, I started to think about the blonde. In a handful of months, Purupi would be graduating and preparing for university. Hard to believe it, really. Did you decide on what to do for university? I brought it up, since it had been a little while since we talked about it. Last time we spoke, she was still unsure. Purupi glanced up at me and nodded. Mm-hmm. she responded in a chipper tone.
I decided to do things a little different, though, but I'm confident in my choice.
Oh? I raised an eyebrow, curious what she changed her mind on. She was up in the air about medical stuff, human or otherwise, so I wondered what she ended up deciding on in the end. What did you go with?
Business,
she smiled. Huh? That was not what I expected to hear at all. Why business? I asked her as we approached the apartment building. Pudupi let go of my hands and placed hers together in front of her chest. She had on a little smirk.
Well,
she chuckled.
I figured that if you keep doing as well as you have been with your passion, you might need to start up your own business. And if it comes to that, I want to be prepared to make good decisions for your future, you know?
The girls grinned. What on earth? I furrowed my brow. You shouldn't be making such a big decision just because of the job path that I chose, I mumbled. You should do something that will benefit you. I worried that she was being too impulsive with her decision. While her saying that she wanted to help me in the long run really meant a lot to me, I was also worried that if something bad were to happen between us, that she would have wasted her time on a useless degree that would stunt her in her adult life. Also, we hadn't been together all that long. She should worry about herself first when it came to stuff like that.
Don't worry, it's not just for you.
She nodded and crossed her arms, stepping in front of me.
Whether or not you pursue your own business won't change anything with this. I have a few other businesses that I'd like to help manage or even start myself if you end up just staying with the cafe.
The girl nodded, informing me. I guess she gave it a lot of thought after all. But the fact that she thought of me at all with her career path made me feel like I should convince her to reconsider. I wasn't worth risking a future over.
But if you need a business partner and someone to help manage your finances, I got you.
The girl shut her eyes and clenched her teeth in a large smile. Jeez. I felt something in my heart flutter. I feel so unworthy of her. This cute girl was just so good to me. I really didn't deserve it, but I then suddenly felt the urge to kiss her. I didn't know why, but everything inside of me was just telling me to do it. Perhaps it was just because her cheeks and lips were dusted a slight pink from the wind, but right then she just looked so kissable. My cheeks flushed at the thought. Was I going to do it? I took a step forward and reached out to her, placing a hand on her cheek. It was really soft and slightly cold from the outside air, despite it being warmer than usual. It was nice. The girl blinked, her eyes open at the touch, immediately locking her gaze with mine. Her eyes blinked curiously, and I felt my heart rate increase. I breathed out and leaned forward, slowly breaking the distance between us. As I approached her, I felt nervousness slowly eat away at me and concerns pop up in my head, but I chose to ignore them. Worrying about insignificant things at a time like this would do me no good. I just went with my instincts and pressed my cold lips to hers. Our lips connected into a kiss, the warmth of her mouth pressing into mine. It was a familiar feeling from when she had first kissed me, but this time I was the one initiating it. It was different. I wasn't really sure what to do since this was my first time kissing someone, but soon after our lips connected, Pudupi's lips slid against my own and deepened the kiss. Clearly, she had a little experience, and I was thankful for it. The sensation, it felt so nice. The blonde's small hands reached up and placed themselves onto my own cheeks, their cold contact making me flinch a little. Felt her lips curve against mine, pulling back out of the kiss. My eyes that had apparently closed themselves earlier fluttered open, looking to the blonde. I didn't know if it had just got colder while we were outside or if our body temperature had rose, but I could very clearly see our breath in the air after our mouths separated. Oh God. I just kissed Pudupi. We just kissed. In front of my apartment complex, no less. The reality sat in and my face felt even hotter than before. I was pretty embarrassed. However, Pudupi didn't seem bothered in the slightest. Her cheeks were flushed, and she had on a large smile, but didn't look the least bit embarrassed. She actually looked really cute. The small girl suddenly lunged at me, wrapping her arms around my torso and digging her face into my chest. I placed a foot back so as to not lose my balance, and I placed a hand on her back. The embrace was warm, and I got goosebumps as her fingers laid on my body. It felt strange, but also really nice.
You're so cute, Kishka!
The girl squealed into my shirt. I lifted a hand to softly touch the back of her head, feeling her soft hair thread between my fingers, and the faint scent of watermelon touched my nose. You too, I said softly, leaning my head down and just barely touching the top of her head. It felt weird to be touching someone that much, but in the moment, it felt nice. Really nice. Maybe this was something I'd get used to after all. Eventually, we went inside, and I made us some food. Even though I had spent more time making sweets as of late, I still enjoyed making a savory treat now and again. That day, I lightly fried some fish and made some miso soup. Nothing too crazy, but enough to satisfy the two of us. Judging by the quietness of the apartment, it seemed like Runaka was out at work and Fumi was still at school. I'd stopped paying mind to when my female roommate got home from school, so I was unaware of any kind of schedule she had. And it was definitely for the best. Runaka usually communicated to me what his schedule was, though. I didn't really know why, but I was fine with it. At least I'd know when I'd get some peace and quiet. As we sat at the table and ate our food, Putupi spoke up.
So, my dad is coming into town this weekend?
The blonde brought up rather casually, her eyes looking to mine after she swallowed her food. I caught her gaze and raised my eyebrows. Ah, that's right. I'd yet to meet him. He's been gone for a while, right? I asked, reaching for my glass of water. What kind of work does he do again? I wasn't sure if Putupi had told me before or not. She smiled.
He does translation work. He works for a few different corporations as an interpreter and helps different companies from other countries communicate.
The girl responded before taking another bite of her food.
He's pretty valuable to the companies because he knows so many languages, so they fly him everywhere for free. Granted, it's always for work, but Mom and I are always welcome to join him, which is cool.
I nodded. It was pretty interesting, and also a little crazy to know that there was a chance that I may have never met Putupi if they would have decided to join her father in another country. What languages does he know? I asked.
He knows Japanese, English, German, French, and a little Chinese and Korean.
The girl beamed as she rattled them off, looking down at her food instead of at me. I nodded slowly. No wonder he was so valuable. He really did know a lot of languages. Wow, I spoke, trying not to keep my thoughts to myself. Putupi nodded in reply, but I watched her smile slowly drop. Uh-oh. What was wrong? I frowned. Are you excited to see him again? I tried to find something positive to bring up. She mentioned him coming back into town, so certainly that meant she was looking forward to it. Putupi nodded, but her expression didn't light up this time. I reached forward and touched her shoulder lightly with my hand, fingers brushing over the strap of her overalls. At the sensation, she looked up at me. Are you okay? I asked her in concern. Putupi stared at me for a moment before offering a small smile and a shrug.
I guess,
she answered half-heartedly. She sighed and then continued to speak.
I just miss him a lot.
It was always strange to hear Putupi sound anything but cheerful, and it made me worry. But I knew that once her dad came home, she would be happy once more. You'll see him soon, I told her, using my thumb to caress her shoulder. The blonde smiled, pausing for a moment before nodding.
You're right.
Her eyes met mine again, her small lips pressed into a smile.
And I was going to invite you and Sedona over for dinner while he's over. Is that okay?
Her question seemed silly. Of course it was okay. It was probably best I met her father sooner, rather than later anyway. Ah, that was when I realized why she asked the way she did. The last time Sedona Hirose and I spoke was kind of tense. That was probably why Putupi seemed apprehensive in asking. Well, firstly, Hirose and I more or less talked everything out. And secondly, I owed Hirose a lot for explaining my side of things to Putupi after our fight. The least I could do is be friendly to her, even if we hadn't solved things entirely. Yeah, that'd be okay. I nodded to the blonde, slowly reaching a hand up to touch the top of her head. The action immediately set a grin on the girl's features, and I couldn't stop myself from grinning in return. After we stared at each other for a bit, the girl broke her gaze from mine and turned back to the kitchen table and the food that set upon her. She took a big spoonful of miso soup and continued grinning at the spread. It was then that the front door was swiftly unlocked and opened, which I turned to look at. I wondered which one of the roommates was home first. Surprisingly, both roommates were home at the same time. Giggling softly, the long-haired woman entered the building with Runaka's arm tightly around her shoulders. He had his face all nuzzled into her neck, finishing the end of his sentence before looking up to see that they had not returned to an empty apartment. "Oh, hey, you two," Runaka grinned, slowly leaning out of Fumi's neck. Upon hearing his words and looking to Putopi and me, Fumi instantly became flustered and fidgeted around, attempting to pull away from Runaka. Not much for PDA even within her own home, huh? Runaka didn't seem to mind, however, keeping his arm tightly around her, holding her close despite her efforts to pry away. Her face formed a pout, and she looked to her strong boyfriend.
Hi, Runaka!
The blonde greeted, turning away from her food to wave at the two. I nodded to them, turning my body to face them as well. Since Fumi's efforts to push away were futile, she decided to spin around and instead hide her face against Runaka. Despite the fact she was hiding, I could still see how red she was just from the color of her ears that peeked out from her hair. "What are you guys doing tonight?" The blue-haired man inquired, shuffling back and forth to remove his shoes while still keeping the girl in his arms. I shrugged in reply. "Nothing planned. Just eating." My voice sounded, echoing the kitchen ever so slightly. Putopi nodded.
I have school tomorrow, so I can't stay out too late, but we were just gonna hang out.
The energetic girl bounced in her seat, turning away from the couple to eat some of her fish. Renaka slowly nodded and smiled. "All right, well, do you two want to see a movie with us?" The man asked. Right when he had done so, Fumi jumped up and then immediately brought her face up to look at his.
Runaka!
You could just barely hear her, as her voice turned into a whisper. Was everything okay with them? Maybe I should speak up for her. "We don't want to intrude if you two want to go alone," I spoke in caution, but the blue-haired man was quick to shut me down. "Oh no, it'll be fine," he grinned widely. He then put his free hand on top of Fumi's head, ruffling it ever so slightly. "Shota's still pretty shy about being seen in a romantic relationship with me is all." He nodded and returned his hand to his side. "This will give her some practice." The man then laughed heartily. Maybe not for the same reasons, but Shota and I really were pretty similar. I trusted Runaka knew what was best, though. I looked to Putopi to get her opinion before saying yes or no, since I was pretty indifferent one way or the other. The girl grinned once our eyes met, followed by a shrug.
As long as I get home before midnight, I'm down for anything.
The girl responded confidently. "Oh, I guess that decided it then." I took a bite of my fish and looked over what was left of it. At least we wouldn't be hungry during whatever showing we decided on. "Awesome. We're going to go see that new horror flick. That okay with you guys?" Runaka asked, his hand caressing Fumi's shoulder as he spoke. I didn't know how well Putopi dealt with horror, but I certainly didn't have an issue. I could be a little jumpy, but nothing past that.
Ooh, that one I keep seeing with the ads online about the white-haired lady?
Putopi stuffed the rest of her food in her mouth before jumping out of her chair and spinning to face the couple. Runaka looked excited at her reply, nodding and smiling wider. Yeah, that one!" Putopi balled her small hands into fists before throwing them up above her in a celebratory stance.
Yeah, I really wanted to see that one.
Putopi nodded and looked back to me, lowering her hands.
Is that okay with you, Kishka?
Even though the movie selection was fine with me, it was nice of her to clarify, just in case. "Yeah, that's fine," I said, offering a small smile. Everything was so calm, so communicative. It felt so fun and so normal. It was strangely nice. The sound of my pen tapping against a pad of paper echoed in my bedroom. It was quiet, but that was mostly because I was the only one home. I was pretty sure Runaka was at work and Fumi was likely at school. Either way, both were gone, which meant I could relax in solitude and silence. And by relax, I meant brainstorm new spring bakery items to introduce to our customers. Even though I was still working on my submission to the next competition, I was being depended on for new seasonal additions. Couldn't let them down after all. But despite my determination, I was struggling to come up with any ideas at all. I kept trying to take pre-existing products and think of a spring spin to put on them, but it just ended up coming off weak and forced. My ideas were either too far-fetched or too plain. They wouldn't do it all. I frowned. Nothing was satisfying my creative side whatsoever that day, and I found myself in a small slump. Maybe I should look online for some inspiration or visit a local cafe to see if anything came to me. I frowned. I didn't want to feel like I was stealing anyone else's idea, though. I sighed and finally set my pen down, raising my hands to my face. I cupped my eyes with my palms and let my fingers thread through my wavy locks. Ugh. I took a deep breath in, and then back out. Just gotta think. After a few moments of silence, while I racked my brain for ideas, my phone went off. It sounded like I was getting a call. It wasn't even 2 p.m. yet, which meant Pudopi was still in school. She was the only one who really called me, so I wondered who else it could have been. I finally looked over at my phone and took a peek at the caller ID. Oh. It was my mother. Immediately, I felt sick, seeing her name appear before me, and I wondered as to why she would be calling me. It was out of nowhere. Whatever the reason, I had a suspicion it wasn't going to be anything good, so I considered not even picking up. I could pretend I was at work. But what if it was something important? What if something happened to Reedna? I frowned at the thought. I'd hate to not know just because I'd let my fear get the best of me. Okay, fine. I'll do it. I slowly picked up my phone off the bed and slid my thumb across the accept call button. I let my phone sit in my hand away from me with the call active for a few moments before saying anything. Deep breath in. And then out. You got this, Kishka. Hello? I answered, phone set against my ear, trying my best to sound as I usually did on the phone. Kishka? My mother's voice sounded on the other end. Hearing it made me a little tense, but I tried not to overthink the situation. It was just a phone call. Whatever happened, I'd handle it. I could even hang up if I didn't like what was happening. Hi, Mother. I replied in a flat tone, sitting back in my seat and focusing my eyes on my empty white wall. The other end was silent for a moment. How are you doing? Her voice was soft, her words feeling gentle and careful with how she spoke. I blinked. Fine, I answered simply. The situation was already uncomfortable. After I'd responded, I didn't know what to say. What could I say? Did I have anything to say? I mean, I guess the polite thing would be to ask how she was doing in return. But I didn't want to pretend like everything between us was okay, because it wasn't. I frowned. We were both silent for a little while, and I began to worry. Did she hang up? I lifted my phone from my ear. No, the phone call was still connected. Maybe I should just hang up. I considered doing so since we weren't exactly talking at that point. Kishka? My mother's voice echoed from the receiver. I put the phone back up to my ear. Yes? After my reply, I could hear my mother exhale slowly. What was going on? Before I had any more time to wonder and worry, my mother spoke up yet again. I'm sorry, Kishka. What? I spoke out loud, without even realizing it, taken aback by my parents' words. She was apologizing? But why? My mother didn't say anything for a moment, and sighed quietly before speaking up once more. I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry, Kishka. She repeated herself, though this time her voice sounded shakier than before. I didn't know what to say, so I stayed silent, processing the information. My brother breathed out into the receiver and continued speaking again. I didn't want things to end up like this, she confessed. I know you're upset, and... She sighed. I can't blame you, but I just wanted you to know that I'm proud of you, and I was wrong to speak so harshly to you about your desires. My mother paused before continuing once more. Kishka, I love you and want you to be happy, and while I was upset with you, I didn't want you to leave me out of your life altogether with. You're my son, and I care about you a lot, and I want to get to know you better. The last part hit me hard. Harder than I would have expected it to. But all things considered, I never expected to hear those words leave her lips to begin with. It was a lot to take in at once. Every word my mother spoke, it stuck with me. I let it repeat in my head over and over, and I reflected on each word. She was proud of me? She actually wanted to get to know me? I felt my eyes get misty as I sat there, speechless. What child didn't want to hear the recognition, approval, and care from their parents? My parents knew me to be responsible before, which is why I was trusted with my brother, cooking, household chores, and balancing school and work. I was reliable in that sense. But eventually, that's all I was good for. They stopped treating me like a son, but instead like a robot, programmed to do certain tasks. My emotional well-being and role as their son weren't a part of the contract. Or at least that's how it felt before. Those words I longed to hear when I spoke with my parents before. I was finally hearing them. My eyes drifted down to my desk. I felt overwhelmed with emotion, was unsure of what to say or do in response. Think, Kishka. You have to say something. Thanks. I mumbled into the phone, trying to think of something else to say. Just saying thank you didn't seem appropriate. I saw an article about you. She spoke up again. I glanced up at my wall. Oh, I didn't know it had been published already. I spoke, raising my eyebrows. She must have seen the magazine that published an article about the competition. I'd heard about it, but was too embarrassed to actually read it. If I wasn't so stubborn, I could have been there cheering you on that day. My mom laughed bitterly, and then cleared her throat after a moment. Sorry. My chest ached. It's okay. And it was. Well, at the time it would have been nice to have her support, but it was over with, and it was nice to know that she would have liked to have changed that. So, I was thinking. Her tone changed. She sounded more sheepish and quieter, which was unusual for her. I raised an eyebrow, even though she couldn't see it. The cafe you work at. Could I stop by? Oh. Will you have time in between work? The words shot out of my lips before I had time to stop them. It wasn't exactly a snarky remark as it was a question, but if she were to perceive it as the former, she wouldn't have been wrong in doing so either. Of course. Her words were rushed, maybe even a little panic sounding. I'll make time for it. While I wasn't holding my breath on it, I appreciated her effort. I nodded. Thanks. What else could I say? I look forward to seeing you then. It felt weird to be saying that to my mother, but if she was making an effort, I should too, right? The sound of my mother exhaling while smiling, a distinct sound, came to my ears. I couldn't help but smile a little in return. Yeah, me too. I'll bring Rina with me if you'd like. She knew how to get on my good side. What she said made me smirk. I scratched at the back of my neck and looked up at my room ceiling, processing our conversation. That'd be nice, I replied. I was sure it'd be a while until I'd see them again, but at least then my mother made a promise. Actually, let's be sure of that. Promise? I spoke firmly into the phone. The question immediately made me smile, and the sound of my mother's laughing came from the other end quite clearly. The mood was lightening. Promise, she replied in between giggles. Now that was a blast from the past. For context, when I was little, before Rena had been born, promise was my go-to question. I don't know why little me was so obsessed with having people promise me things, but more specifically from my mother. But it was just something I did. Dumb little kid stuff. I wasn't sure if my mother would remember at that point, but judging by her reaction, she remembered it clearly. Okay, I said back. I'll talk to you later then. My mother made a confirming noise and stopped her giggling to respond to me. Okay, Kishka. I love you. Your father does too. I'll see you sometime. And with that, our phone conversation ended. After we hung up, I sat there for a little while and registered everything that had happened. Huh. The situation didn't really turn out all that bad. I was thankful, especially since I expected otherwise. Maybe our relationship could be rekindled, but only time would tell. And I wasn't going to hold my breath for my parents. I knew better than that. It was a normal cafe day, like any other. Business was steady, and orders were as expected. Since it was a Friday, there were multiple high schoolers inside the cafe to enjoy the start to their weekend. Today, one of those high schoolers just happened to be Puropi. Her dad was coming in on his flight early the next morning, and later that same day would be the first time I'd meet him. I was a little nervous about it, but Purupi had assured me on multiple occasions that it'd be nothing to worry about. He was apparently a really kind man and took to meeting new people very well. I hoped she was right. At that moment in time, I was running the front register because one of the waitresses had to head home early due to a scheduling conflict. Since it wasn't overly busy, I was able to run both the front and the bakery orders without an issue. But when there was nothing to do, I'd float back to the table Purupi sat at and relax. She, of course, had ordered something I worked on that day, which just happened to be a mini maple cake. It had a pancake-like texture, and the batter was flavored sweetly with maple syrup. I was rather fond of it, even if it was a little tedious to make. As expected, Purupi loved it all the same. I watched her devour it one bite at a time, flailing her body about as she consumed the sweet treat. She really was cute. Apparently, I was spacing out watching her eat, because when she addressed me, I jumped a little.
Kishka, why are you smiling so much?
Her tone was teasing, clearly knowing why I was smiling. I frowned. Why do you keep wiggling around so much? I shot back, which made the blonde flush in return.
I can't help how I react when I eat your food. Stop making such yummy stuff and I'll stop going crazy over it.
Her whine came back at me, though none of what she said was even remotely insulting, as expected. I shook my head, not able to pry the small smile off of my lips. What a strange girl. Next time I'll make sure to bring out the stuff I burned. I smirked at her. I bet you won't even be able to tell a difference. Purupi's pout appeared on her face, her little cheeks puffing out as her eyebrows lowered.
You aren't allowed to live with Runaka anymore. His teasing habits are rubbing off on you,
she complained loudly, balling her hands into fists. I couldn't help but grin at her. It was amusing, but maybe she was right. I guess I didn't really joke with her like that a few months prior. The door to the cafe then opened, which caused me to stand up and be attentive to anyone who may have needed assistance. One of the other waitresses also turned to face the door to greet the new customers, but when I noticed who it was, I relaxed. Speak of the devil, I mumbled under my breath, noting the blue-haired man who had entered the establishment. Joining Runaka was Fumi, the two looking as they normally did around that time. Runaka was wearing work attire, and Fumi was wearing something warm and elaborate. I didn't stop to stare for too long, though, instead just waving and looking back to Purupi. The girl lit up at seeing the two, standing up from her seat and waving enthusiastically. Hey, you two! Runaka grinned wide at our greetings, simply waving off the approaching waitress. The associate zipped back around and attended to another table instead, as my roommate approached the table Purupi and I were at. Is Kishka being lazy on the job? The man teased, thus proving our earlier statements. I rolled my eyes. Give me something to do if you don't like it, I retorted in my usual tone. Runaka laughed. Well, I just might then. With that, the man yanked a seat from under an empty table and slid it up to Purupi and I's table, sitting himself down there. Is it cool if we join you? He officially asked the blonde. She nodded as happily as ever, looking up to Fumi and patting the empty chair next to her that used to be my seat. The long-haired girl looked a little taken aback by the gesture, looking around at both Runaka and I before looking back to Purupi. Did she need permission to sit or something? I need to head back if you guys are going to order something, so take a seat, Fumi. I tried to encourage her, even though I was sure Runaka could have just come up with something to calm her anyway. The girl nodded, knocking some hair into her face before pulling it back away. Okay, she replied quietly, moving to the chair and scooting up closer to the table itself. With that, I stepped closer to them and slipped my hands into my apron pockets. Do you guys have an idea of what you want, or did you want a menu? I asked, looking over the three. Purupi still had a little bit of her milkshake left, so she was unlikely to order more, but the other two who hadn't ordered yet perked up. Honestly, I could go for whatever. I kind of forgot to eat this morning, and I've been going since 7, so I think I could eat a whole house. Runaka let rip a laugh, turning to his girlfriend. Fumi caught his gaze and then looked up to me before looking away again. Just a milkshake is fine for me. Fumi spoke up, looking to Purupi and her drink. I guess she was inspired. I nodded at them and looked to Runaka, trying to decide on what I could make him. If he was really that hungry, he should have ordered some of the real food we had on our kitchen menu instead. Is there anything in particular you want, Runaka? I tried to fish a more specific answer out of him to make my job easier. I could work with specific cravings, but being told, make whatever, wasn't really going to cut it. Runaka stretched in his seat, raising both arms above his head and yawning. He groaned as he thought. how about something with nuts? I'm sure I could use the protein or whatever. Or whatever. This guy, I swear. I nodded in reply. Nuts it is then, was all I said, before turning around to head back into the kitchen. This is when I heard the front door to the cafe open once more. I spun around since both of our waitresses were busy attending tables and went to greet the new customer. Oh, it was Hirose. Oh, welcome, I greeted her, watching her mellow expression soften as she saw me.
Hey, Emochi,
she smiled, raising a hand and waving ever so slightly before returning her hand to her side. Putopi is over there if you want to sit with her, I said, shrugging to my right where the group was sat at. The girl nodded and beamed at my words, looking to the blonde.
Thanks, Emochi,
she grinned, turning to walk off to the table. I decided to join her on her trek back since we were heading in the same direction. She decided to take the opportunity to start a conversation with me.
How have you been lately? Congratulations on winning that competition, by the way.
Thanks, I replied, looking to her and then back in front of me. Even though things were mostly resolved, I still felt a little awkward. I probably need to thank her for all she'd done before, too. I've been good. I hesitated at first. I was pretty good, wasn't I? Hirose picked up on my hesitation, though, and raised an eyebrow.
Yeah?
She smiled.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. You're excited for tomorrow, right?
Ah, that's right. Hirose would be at the dinner, too. I had almost forgotten. Yeah, a little nervous, though. I forced myself to speak my mind. Instead of keeping it in. But it'll be good for Putopi to see him. I tried to stay on the positive side of things, and to change the subject focus from me onto something else, mostly out of habit.
You're right,
Hirose nodded and crossed her arms over her chest.
It'll be a good time for everyone, I'm sure.
The girl nodded once more in my direction before turning her attention to the table we were slowly approaching. This was when Putopi noticed her friend.
Tadana!
She shouted the girl's first name out enthusiastically, rising from her chair and waving. Her friend waved back and joined the girl at the table, immediately embracing one another in a hug. The two began to talk amongst each other with a flurry of words exchanged. Ah, I was missing my chance. I frowned. Hirose, I spoke up, a bit louder than usual, so she'd hear me over Putopi's rambling. The volume took the table by surprise, looking my way. Even though all eyes were on me, I tried to ignore it and just focus on the class rep. It was about her anyway. Thank you for everything, I said simply, instantly quieter since no one at the table was talking anymore. At my words, the girl smiled.
You're welcome,
she beamed, staring my way before turning back to her friend and continuing their conversation. Yeah. I smiled at the group, turning away once more. I started to head into the kitchen to begin the orders Runaka and Fumi had placed. The milkshake was taken up by a coworker of mine while I began working on heating up and dressing up a generous serving of pecan pie. I hadn't worked on the particular pie myself, but I ate a piece earlier, so I knew it was good. Dolloping some freshly whipped cream on top, followed by a caramel syrup, I readied Runaka's dish for delivery. When I had both orders ready, I left out onto the floor to deliver them. I approached their table, smiling as Putopi and I exchanged looks before hearing my name being called.
Kishka!
Came a familiar voice. I turned to look in the direction in which it came from. By the front door of the cafe stood my little brother Rina and my mother. My eyes widened at the sight. She really did come to visit, and so soon. I started to go head in their direction before remembering that I was still holding 2 food items. I turned back to my friend's table, placing Runaka's dish down in front of him and following suit with Fumi's milkshake. Once I had done so, I turned back towards the front of the cafe and walked up to meet my brother and mother at the door. They must have just walked in. I wondered why everyone happened to pop in that day. Was something special going on? I approached my brother with open arms, him rushing up to me and wrapping his own small arms around me. I returned the favor and picked him up as I embraced him, lifting his feet off of the ground. I didn't know what it was that made me feel so compelled to lift him up. I guess I was just feeling especially emotional. Rina giggled happily into my ear, holding me tightly, then wrapping his legs around me as well. Now tightly clung to me. My brother pulled his face out from my chest and looked into my eyes.
Mom and I came to visit!
He beamed. I hadn't seen him look that happy since December. It made me feel so nice. Because of such, I couldn't stop a big smile from stretching across my own face, and I nodded in reply, tapping my forehead against his. And then this is the picture for this page. I can see that. I'm happy you're here, I replied. I slowly leaned back down, kneeling on one knee and loosening my hold on the ginger so he could return to a standing position. Once he was down on the ground, I turned my attention to my mother, who also had on a large smile. Her expression was a little different from Reedna's. Relief, maybe? My mother took a step forward and reached for my hands, grabbing them both within hers and squeezing mine ever so slightly. Her hands were soft and cold, likely from the outside temperature. I don't know how you grew up so fast, but in just a matter of months, you already look so grown up. My mother spoke in both disbelief, but also in awe. She squeezed my hands once more. I'm so proud of you. I can tell this place is lucky to have you. She gave my hands one final squeeze before taking her hands back, smiling at me. Thanks, I said in reply. A smile stuck to my features as she complimented me. I should probably actually seat her. Just as I turned to look at any open seating, I was met with one of the waitresses.
Need any help, Emoji? I can serve these two if you'd like. I don't want you to get backed up if it gets busy.
The girl spoke, smiling my way and then smiling back to my family. I nodded. Yeah, that'd be nice, I replied. I wanted to give them the full cafe experience so that my mother knew what it was like there on a daily basis. While I wasn't as worried about letting her down, I still wanted her to get a good understanding of my job.
Sure thing. Welcome, you two. Follow me and we'll get you started on something really good by Emoji, okay?
The waitress spoke.
He's our bakery manager, so whatever he serves up ought to blow you away.
Even though I'd begun to walk away at that point, I couldn't help but overhear the waitress's last comment, which made me a little embarrassed. Jeez, I don't want their expectations to be too high now. I waved at my little brother before heading back to the table that held all my friends. Almost immediately after returning to the table, Pudipi spoke up.
That's your mom and brother, right?
She asked, looking over to where they had been sat. Even though her bringing so much attention to my family made me a little nervous in front of everyone at the table, I tried not to let it bother me. Yeah, my mother called the other day, said something about stopping by, but I didn't think it'd be this soon, I confessed, shrugging and looking to the others. It's pretty good, Kishka. I'm glad you all made up, Runaka said with a grin, stealing a sip from Fumi's drink.
Hey,
the girl pouted, scooting her milkshake closer to her side of the table, despite how small her side was. When I looked down, I was surprised to see that Runaka had already finished his order. Wow. Fumi had barely touched hers.
Yay! I'm glad that things are getting better, Kishka.
Pudipi clapped her hands together lightly, before looking as if she'd just remembered something.
Oh yeah, Sedona wanted to order something.
Oh, right. I never got a chance to ask her what she wanted. What would you like? I asked her. She was now seated at the table with everyone else, leaving one of our other tables bare of any chairs. It wasn't like we were busy, so it didn't really matter.
Cheesecake and a few macarons, please.
The proud girl grinned, her sweet tooth burying its head that evening. Very well, I'll be back with that soon then. I headed back into the kitchen and began to work on Hirosei's order when another order came in the window.
Emoji, this is for that lady and that kid.
The waitress alerted me as she hung it up, standing up on her toes to catch my gaze in the window before lowering back down and leaving. A confused expression fixated on my features, not sure as to why she looked at me, but my look was for no one since she had left immediately afterwards. There were some strange people out there. I took a good look at the ticket, looking over everything that was ordered. A crepe sundae, a mini apple crumble, and the cake that I'd brought home for my parents to try back before our second fight. She did mention liking it back then. I smiled. Unfortunately, the item wasn't something we normally carried. I tapped my chin, wondering if we had any left in stock. I did an inventory of the backstock freezer this morning. If I recall correctly, there should be one that I made at the beginning of this year that's still good to be sold. I nodded. Perfect. After I had one of my waitresses deliver Hirosei's order, I began to work on my family's order. Once completed, I put them in the window and then proceeded to package the cake to go, myself. I wanted to be able to deliver it to their table personally. After a few moments, I left the kitchen and walked out onto the cafe floor, walking to the table my brother and mother were sat at. They were both happily eating away at their desserts, huge smiles upon their faces. God, it felt so surreal. I couldn't believe that it was actually happening. My mother was in the cafe eating my desserts and beaming from the sensation. I felt so happy, so unbelievably happy. I could cry. I walked to their table, presenting a fancy-looking carrying box with the cake inside. "Does it taste okay?" I asked as they ate out their sweets, even though I could see from their faces that it did. I still wanted to hear it. Call me selfish if you must, but I really, really wanted to hear it. My mother met my gaze, with Rena looking back to me as well. She nodded, a hand raised to her face as she spoke. "Kishka, this is amazing. This really tastes so good," she gushed, looking as if she was on the brink of tears as well. "Oh, Mother, please don't cry. I will too." Rena luckily joined into the conversation, making it a little less emotional.
"I love this, Kishka. You're the biggest, best chef out there."
My brother laughed immediately afterwards, drinking up a sugary beverage that they'd ordered as well before looking to me again.
"Mom says we can come here every weekend. I can't wait to see you more."
"I usually work weekends, so I'll probably see you every time you do. You can ask the waitress, and they'll tell you if I'm working in the back, okay?" I leaned down to Rena, placing a hand on top of his head and rustling his hair slightly. I had to try and hold in my excitement from hearing my brother's words. The thought of them coming to see me every weekend, the fact that my mother was putting in extra effort to spend time with both of her sons now, I couldn't express how happy and relieved it made me feel. I was just so happy. "Anyway, here's your cake. It's the last we had, but it should still be good. Leave it out on the counter for 12 hours to properly defrost, and it should be good for another week after that," I explained, setting the cake down on the extra chair at their table. My mother nodded in reply. "Sounds great. Thank you, Kishka," she replied. I stared her way for a few moments before noticing her eyes seemed to be looking past me. Trying to follow her gaze, I looked behind me, only to feel a hand grab my side before I had seen the culprit. "Puropi?" I jumped ever so slightly, seeing the blonde at my side. She had on a sheepish expression, looking from my mother to myself. What was... Oh. I think I knew what she wanted. I smiled. "Oh, Puropi. Mother, this is Puropi Kikamura, my girlfriend. Puropi, this is my mother. You've already met Rena, though." I introduced them, raising a hand out to the two's table. Rena smiled and beamed Puropi's way before returning to his sweet and continuing to eat away. "Oh, I didn't know..." My mother stopped herself from continuing and instead stood up and bowed her head slightly towards the blonde. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Puropi. You two look like a wonderful couple." Puropi was taken a bit off guard by my mother's formalities, immediately letting go of my side and bowing in response, though deeper than my mother.
"The pleasure's all mine, Miss Amochi."
You could hear a little nervousness in the way the blonde spoke, and it was pretty cute. I wondered if I would sound like that around her parent. The two exchanged smiles once they resumed their casual postures, and I smiled. Well, that was one less thing to worry about, I guess. Anyway, I have to get back to work and clean up. Thanks for coming by. I'll see you next week. I didn't want it to seem mandatory for them to come back so soon, but I really hoped they would. My mother smiled and nodded.
"Yes, we'll see you next week."
"Thank you, Kishka." My mother's soft tone and words calmed me. I was so relieved that that hurdle was removed from my life. I really felt like I could focus solely on the next competition without any worries or stresses to hold me back. I gave my mother and Rena one last smile before turning back around to head to the back of the cafe. As I did so, Puropi slipped her hand into mine, the warmth taking me off guard. I felt my face heat up immediately at the gesture. "Puropi..." We were in public and right in front of my mother. I wasn't sure how to feel about it, but after the blonde squeezed my hand and nuzzled against my arm, butterflies started to fly in my stomach. Maybe it wasn't that bad after all.
"Thanks, Kishka,"
she said quietly to me, letting go of my hand and looking deep into my eyes. I smiled. I didn't know what she was thanking me for, but I'd take it. "You're welcome," I replied, putting a hand out to touch the other side of her small, soft face with my fingers. There was a lot of new things I learned ever since I met this girl. As strange and overwhelming and as uncomfortable as some things made me feel, in the end, I think it helped me grow a little as a person. Change isn't that scary after all. The End.
That's it. That's the end of the novel, guys.